Okay then. Hello and welcome to episode 129 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and I sit before you unwashed and unkempt on a comfortable weekend. And I'm not even wearing real clothes today. And I got the mandatory beverage. And because there are so many questions this time, I've got 2 emergency backup beverages just in case. And I think I'm going to be cracking into at least one of them because we've got about 50 questions and this could run 3 hours. And so I might as well just dive right into this. And the first question is from Gnostic Rocker. And Gnostic Rocker, or Gnostic Rocker, says, you mentioned that at varying times in your life you'd been skeptical about the goodness of humanity and chosen to shun the crowds, preferring the company of being alone with nature and animals to being with people. I feel the same, but I wonder, what was your journey to that realization, and was it a difficult process to accept that you felt that way? In my case, it was difficult because I wrestled with why I felt that way. Was it because I felt superior to other people, which I don't, or was it from some kind of Nietzschean ressentiment? Almost said it like it was an English word or something. Or perhaps projection of my own shadow self onto others. Now, after years of contemplation, I'm fully at ease with not really wanting to be with the crowds. I've worked out why I feel that way. I'm okay with it. I'm curious about your journey to such a state of mind. And I really didn't have a journey because I was born that way. I think it was Henry David Thoreau said that it seems to be a law that a person cannot have a deep, he cannot be a people, he has to be that, essentially what Thoreau said is that you have to be either a people person or a nature person. You cannot have a deep regard for both man and nature. And I'm just a nature person. Ever since I was a kid, I've kind of disliked the human race. Like when I was a kid, my 2 favorite movies, I was just telling my sweetheart this today, my 2 favorite movies when I was a kid were Planet of the Apes and The Omega Man. Both of them about the collapse of civilization, the collapse of the human race. In one case, into essentially mute animals, and in the other into like strange zombie type creatures. So, I just born that way. I just prefer the company of animals or trees. With some exceptions, there are some animals I don't like. Probably even a few trees I don't like. And I've tried to understand it. I think to some degree, it's like the closer a being is to me, the more critical I am of it. It's like I'm kind of critical of myself. It's like, why did I do that? Why didn't I do it this other way? Or this kind of thoughts can arise. And the more closely some being resembles me, the more critical I am of that being. And the more I'm likely to disapprove of it. Like a dumb animal, they're dumb, they got excuses. Or a person that's like less similar to me than other people, I'm much more likely to have Christian charity towards that person. It's just the closer you get to being me, the more I am likely to have like a critical attitude because, it's like I have a conscience with regard to myself. I've got like principles and standards and so forth. And the closer someone is to me, the more I apply those standards onto that other person. And then they're more likely to violate those standards. And that's not the whole story, but that is one aspect of why I tend to prefer the company of lizards to the company of humans. Although in my old age, I am becoming more tolerant of my fellow man. And my father was the same way. It was like, he wrote poetry sometimes, my father did. And one excerpt from his poems is, I've lashed out with hard and calloused hands at the imperfections of my fellow man. And my hands aren't as calloused as his probably, but it's a similar thing. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Gnostic Rocker's second question, which is, Buddhism seems to be in accord with apophatic theology. What's your perspective on that? And then kind of as a little commentary, he's got 17th century mystic Angelus Silesius seems so close to Dhamma insight too, as is Persian Islamic mystic Mahmud Shabistari in his 14th century writings. And then he includes some quotes from them, which I won't necessarily read here, and some links and so forth. And he says, these remind me of the essence of Sutta Udana Idivodaka Dhammapada. So I guess the main question here is, what's my perspective on Buddhism seeming to be in accord with apophatic theology? Well, I mean, setting aside the whole theology part, because Buddhism isn't referring to a capital G God, other than as a kind of delusional wrong view. But Buddhism is apophatic with regard to the ultimate, with regard to the absolute. And a lot of very intelligent Buddhists just absolutely cannot get this. That even with regard to no self, that Buddhism has an apophatic attitude towards reality. That reality cannot be expressed in symbols. It cannot be said in words. Like, the name that can be named is not the eternal name. That is just basic to early Buddhism. And even a lot of just intelligent monks just cannot get it. And there's going to be one of these monks, apparently, that's going to be mentioned in one of the questions below. But my main introduction to apophatic theology was The Mystical Theology of the Pseudo-Dionysius, which you can download for free off the internet, and it takes just a few minutes to read. It's not very long. And yeah, this wise people, sages around the world, can come to the same conclusion, which is you cannot express the highest truth in words. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. As the very first verse of the Tao Te Ching says. So, yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense to me that, Buddhism does not have a monopoly on wisdom. There's going to be wise people all over the world. Some people will be wise even in spite of their culture. Like, to some degree, Jesus of Nazareth was like this. He was so far beyond his culture that even his own disciples didn't really understand him, apparently. So, see, what's the question, though? My perspective on Buddhism being in accord with apophatic theology? Yeah, it's in accord with apophatic anyway. The theology part really doesn't apply to Buddhism, unless you want to just use theology as, like the philosophy of the ultimate. Something like that, the absolute. So yeah, I got no problem with that. And then, so the Buddha was kind of an apophatic philosopher, like one of the main apophatic philosophers of ancient India. In a way, he was like the first really big name apophatic philosopher in India. And the Hindus still, they have to have everything nailed down in words for the most part. They'll have this elaborate philosophy for trying to describe the indescribable. Buddhism went the same route with Abhidhamma, the commentarial tradition, just established orthodoxies of the various schools. They try to explain everything. They're just locked in their head. Philosophers tend to be intellectual to the point of just being addicted to their own intellect. So I guess Nagarjuna kind of moved back towards apophaticism, but he did it in a very intellectual way. Like anyone who reads the Mula Majjhimaka Karaka, it's very complicated intellectual arguments, the whole purpose of which is to just destroy philosophy, leaving just this desolate wasteland of silence behind through which reality can shine. So I guess I answered that question. And as I say, I got lots of questions. I shouldn't really be taking a lot of time answering a single question unless I just happen to feel like it. So, Gnostic Rocker's third question, as I scroll down here a little bit, is as follows. I wonder what you make of the research work of Melford Spiro, writing on Burmese religious motivation from an anthropological Freudian point of view. In the early 90s, I studied in a Burmese forest hermitage in Japan with an ex-Zen monk who had converted to Theravada. I told him I was considering a life in the robes. He insisted I read Spiro's book cover to cover before I make any such decisions. That book, Buddhism and Society, a Great Tradition and Its Burmese Vicissitudes, had a profound influence on the way I understood the psychological underpinnings of the monastic life. Since you know the ordained life so well from the inside and outside, I'm curious to hear your view. Well, the only book I've read by Melford Spiro was Burmese Supernaturalism. And I never read this other one, the Buddhism and Society, a Great Tradition and Its Burmese Vicissitudes. But I assume it would be more or less in the same vein with the same general attitude, since it's the same general person who's writing both books. And Melford Spiro was trying to describe Burmese supernaturalism, like their belief in witchcraft and ghosts and other supernatural entities and demonic possession and wizardry and all this kind of stuff. And he obviously didn't believe any of it. That he was like a Western 20th century secular humanist who probably didn't believe in any kind of religion other than like scientism mainly, maybe. Or who knows, maybe he was like some sort of secular Christian. I don't know. But he obviously didn't believe that, you know, the stuff that he was writing about. He was doing it as an anthropologist, which supposedly would imply that he would have an unbiased, objective approach. But really, it doesn't work that way. That everyone is biased, and he was simply biased in favor of 20th century secular humanism, whatever trends were going on in cultural anthropology at the time. And it was pretty obvious that it was sort of a condescending attitude towards Burmese supernaturalism. And with regard to Buddhism, it may be that he'd be a little more respectful, maybe a little less obvious in his disbelief. Well, not just overtly saying, I don't believe this shit, but still, you know, he's coming up with alternate theories, you know, like hysteria and this kind of thing, just cultural conditioning as ways of describing these allegedly supernatural events. And to some degree, I can relate, like the phenomenon of the Nat Kado in Burma. Nat Kado literally means a small g god's wife. And when Melford Spiro wrote his book, most Nat Kados were either like teenage girls or women around the age of menopause. And of course, he describes this. Well, I suppose I should describe Nat Kados a little better. That a Nat Kado is a woman who is possessed by a spirit. And at certain festivals, they'll dance orgiastically, just like they're possessed. You know, they'll just dance like crazy, and sometimes they will prophesy, sometimes just emitting gibberish, like someone speaking in tongues at like a Christian revival meeting. And Melford Spiro just had this idea that it was a kind of hysteria, that they're working off repressions, like the teenage girl, because she's still kind of unwillingly a virgin because she's not married yet. And in village Burma, you don't have sex until you're married or engaged at the very least. And the menopausal women, you know, they're just sort of asserting their femininity and putting it out there, you know, their waning sexuality or their waning sexual attractiveness and so forth. Nowadays, Nat Kados apparently seem to be mostly latent homosexual men in Burma. So, I mean, it's like an opportunity to just flaunt oneself, to just let it all out. But he took this approach to just about every aspect of Burmese supernaturalism, just coming up with some psychological alternative explanation to, you know, taking the paranormal at face value. And whether he does that with Buddhism or not, I don't know. But I would say that if you want to understand Buddhism or Burmese Buddhism, Melford Spiro will give you a certain angle on it. It'll give you a certain perspective from a kind of skeptical, not even really skeptical, but just kind of a materialist Western point of view. So let's see, what's the question though? What do I make of the research work of Melford Spiro writing on Burmese religious motivation? Yeah, well, I never read his book on Burmese religious motivation. I only read his book on supernaturalism. And I might be going through 3 beverages this evening because I work nights now, and so I wake up around noon usually, and so the usual schedule when it's still daytime outside when I'm doing Q&As, it doesn't work that way anymore. I'm usually doing them at night now, and it's nighttime where I am right now. And even the fish tank, it's got like it's in moonlight mode already. So let's see here. I guess I answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Lord. And Lord says, I've been practicing for about 1.5 years now, and most times I can dissolve my sense of self and experience rapture. Is that a normal thing you would say for a layman like myself? And have you experienced earth-shattering bliss and contentment before? So that's kind of 2 questions, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Guess I'll separate it. But Lord is already transgressive with regard to the number of questions asked, so maybe I shouldn't be multiplying the number of questions he has asked. So with regard to Lord, he's been meditating for about 1.5 years, apparently, and he says he can dissolve his sense of self and experience rapture. And then, is that a normal thing, you would say, for a layman like myself? Well, I mean, it's not mainstream. It's not that normal, but it's certainly not anything completely, off the bell-shaped curve. I mean, I've met lots of people who are just good at meditating, even like they can be a relative beginner and they'll sit down and just go into some fairly good samadhi. And, I knew this one layman. He eventually became a monk, but he didn't last very long, where he would just get drunk on piti. When he'd be doing like intensive meditation, it was like he was just getting drunk. He was so happy just experiencing this bliss that, I mean, eventually he sold his business. He got rid of all of his stuff. He went to Burma, was ordained at Pandita Rama, and he was just getting so intoxicated on piti or rapture that, I mean, he's just bursting out in guffawing laughter for no apparent reason, just kind of dancing around, jumping on his bed, just kind of trying to work off all this energy. And eventually he just was told he's going to have to leave. He had to go back home again. And I never heard from him since. He was a really good guy. I hope everything worked out well for him in the long run. But yeah, there are some people who, like Burmese villagers especially, they can go to a beginning meditation retreat and just go into these states of bliss. It's like deep meditation or deep samadhi, relatively deep anyway. And, they just don't think as much as the average person, or they can just dissociate. Because a lot of this really deep meditation for a lot of people is a kind of dissociation where your entire mind isn't pacified. It's just you're kind of in this one compartment of your mind that is pacified and blissed out. But still, it doesn't make much of an effect on your overall personality when you're not meditating, because it's just sort of a sealed off compartment. So with people like that, and I don't know what kind of person Lord is really, but with people like that, how do I explain it? I mean, I've talked about this before, that meditating just makes you a better meditator. It doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of influence on what's going on in your everyday life if you're that kind of person. But then some people, they're just good meditators. It just works that way. And it's probably more common outside of Western civilization, where people are just compulsive thinkers, sort of like conditioned into the cult of objectivity and just like analyzing everything all the time. The average like Burmese villager, they just don't seem to think very much. So they can sit down and go into deep meditation relatively easily, although in many cases they're so dogmatic in their approach to Buddhism that they don't really know what to do with these deep states. And even the monks, who's just usually like some village sayadaw who himself, I mean, he doesn't have very deep experience in meditation, he can't really guide them. So let's see, what is the question? Oh, what would I see? Is that a normal thing, you would say, for a layman like himself? It's not wildly unusual. It's certainly kind of an outlier. It'd be less than 2% of the population probably, or maybe, in outside of Western civilization, it might be 5%, but still, it's unusual kind of, but it's not like extremely rare. So I'm just going to move on to Lord's second question, which is the second half of the first question. And have you experienced earth-shattering bliss and contentment before? Well, I don't know how you would define earth-shattering. I never really shattered the earth. I mean, I experienced bliss in meditation, like deep states of meditation where I had no doubt whatsoever this is closer to reality than anything I've experienced before. And 5 minutes of this is well worth 20 years of struggling and floundering in a fourth world country, just working towards this. So whether it could compare with what Lord experienced, I don't know. It might be a whole different kind of thing. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Lord's second or third question here. What are your thoughts on people like Ajahn Muji, Papji, and the like, people who teach Neo-Advaita? Well, I had a friend who was into Ajahn back around 2011 or 12, and so I watched one or two of his videos out of curiosity, and I mean, he's kind of like Eckhart Tolle. He seemed nervous at the beginning of the speech, which kind of struck me as something that an enlightened being might not be. Also, he had certain mannerisms in his speech, like saying like kinda a lot. It might be like 2 or 3 kindas in one sentence. I'm not sure if it was kinda, but it was one of those kind of words that are just used as filler. They don't really mean anything. So, my Muji, I have known nothing about Muji. Papji, I don't even know who Papji is. I mean, people like Eckhart Tolle, I know who that is. But I don't know if he would be technically a teacher of Neo-Advaita. But people who teach Neo-Advaita, in a way, it's just sort of like not having a structure to what you're experiencing. It's like they didn't get enlightened necessarily through some rigid religious or spiritual structure. And so when they're teaching what their experience is like, it's just sort of amorphous. But I really can't, my thoughts on people like Ajahn Muji, Papji, and the like, I really don't have many thoughts on these people. There's different ways of climbing the same mountain. And you can get to the top of the mountain from different angles. And there's different ways of explaining like relatively advanced spiritual states and how to get there, although the practices seem to be relatively uniform. It's like the higher up you get, the closer you get. You might be climbing the same mountain from 2 different sides, and so you might be very different down towards the bottom, but the higher up you get, the more it comes together. And that's the way spirituality is, that like a Christian and a Buddhist might be very different in their like base dogmas, down towards the bottom. But as they get higher and higher and higher, so a lot of the Christians and a lot of the Buddhists too will never get anywhere near the top. That even the system might not even allow for that. But the closer to the top they get, the more they just converge until they're in agreement when they get to the top, so long as they're not insisting upon any of the beginner level dogmas. So Neo-Advaita is just sort of a it'd be more modern, obviously, because it's Neo, but it would be, like a less classical version of Advaita Vedanta, which is based on the Upanishadic literature of ancient India. So I'm not sure how well I answered that one, but I'm going to move on to Lord's third or possibly even fourth question. And he asks a fifth question or a fourth question. And since the limit really is 3, and we're arguably, like, plausibly up to 4 already, I'm just going to, he can ask the next question for a different Q&A, I guess. So his last question here that I'm going to answer is, have you met any black monks before from the West who were ordained? And I think I've met one black monk before, possibly 2, but for sure I remember one. He was at Neo-Advaita in Rangoon, and he was a temporary monk. And he had learned the, what method was it? It wasn't the Mahasi method. He was at Chan Meet, which is in the Mahasi tradition, the Sun Lun method, I think it was, which includes a lot of heavy breathing, especially towards the beginning. And he was all hyped up about becoming a teacher of the Sun Lun method in the West. He came from California, and he didn't last very long as a monk. And he's the only black monk that I think I've ever met that I can think of, other than some very dark-skinned Sri Lankan monks. But there are a few monasteries in Africa. There's a famous one. I think it's, Uganda or Rwanda, something like that. That there actually is a monastery. I have seen like videos of black monks in Africa going for alms round and villagers putting food in their bowl, that kind of thing. So they do exist, although I've only met one personally, and he was just a temporary monk. He lasted just a few weeks or months before dropping back out again, which was his plan from the beginning. So I'm just going to move on to Quaesitor. And let's see, I think Quaesitor has 4 questions too. People are getting transgressive here. Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure I shouldn't read all 3 of them. He's got one follow-up question, which I guess I should read because that's his first question. And then he's got another follow-up question at the end, which, wait a minute. Let's see. I don't know. So anyways, I'm just going to answer the first 3, just in chronological order, I guess. So Quaesitor asks a follow-up question to a question he asked in the previous Q&A that I answered, apparently not in a fully satisfactory manner. And I'm making sure that the computer is charging. And it is. So he says, I find it strange that Buddha would have thought the formless jhanas were not the way. Then he meditates in 4th jhana, which are the formless jhanas, and finds the necessary insight within that to gain enlightenment. Also, he probably would not have had a realization that the 1st jhana is the way if he had rejected the formless jhanas, which is why I'm thinking it has to do with the difference between absorption and full awareness jhanas, since there is a difference between experiencing jhana through deep concentration versus experiencing it because there aren't enough hindrances left to stop the jhana from arising. Thoughts, please, if there's more to add. Well, again, this is essentially the same question as he asked in the previous Q&A about this weird legend where the Buddha has 2 meditation instructors before he becomes the Buddha, before he becomes enlightened. And they teach him the highest possible jhana. And his first teacher taught him up to he mastered the first 4 standard jhanas plus the first 3 formless jhanas. And then his next teacher taught him all the formless jhanas too. And then he realized this isn't the way to become enlightened. And then at a later time, he realized, and this is, all right, first he goes to the meditation instructors, masters all the jhanas that you can possibly master, realizes that's not good enough. Then he goes off into the forest and starts torturing himself, doing severe austerity for 6 years, realizes that isn't good. And then he recalls when he was a kid and his father was plowing a field and he was sitting under a tree watching his father plow a field. that he spontaneously went into first jhana, and then he thinks that's it. That's how I become enlightened. So it's a mixed up legend. Apparently, it's like two different legends that were cobbled together. That Quasar is obstinately like assuming that this is like some kind of historical objective fact, that that's the way it happened, and I just don't think so. So it's just a confused legend in my opinion. But his way, see, let's just read over this a little better here. I find it strange that Buddha would have thought the formless jhanas were not the way. Then he meditates in fourth jhana, which are the formless jhanas, not necessarily. The four formless jhanas, because in my opinion, they're somewhat anachronistic and are just tacked on to the standard four jhanas. They were added as a kind of annex to fourth jhana. So originally, fourth jhana was not a formless jhana, unless, I mean, in a way it is, but according to Orthodox tradition, standard fourth jhana still has a meditation object, and so it isn't really formless. And so then they take the four formless jhanas, which I consider to be added on later, and they just kind of include them as like subgroups or like subdivisions of fourth jhana. So let's see here. He meditates in fourth jhana, which are the formless jhanas, he says, but not necessarily, finds the necessary insight within that to gain enlightenment. But no, it was like first jhana, that he realized that first jhana, which might just mean jhana in general, which completely disregards the legend that he had already mastered all the jhanas before he took up the 6 years of severe austerity and rejected it as not the path. So trying to make sense of this, I mean, you can just do as many mental gymnastics as you can to try and rationalize this, starting with the assumption that it's objective history, which in my opinion, it is not. So, I mean, you can just stretch and twist and just bust your brain trying to work out some way for this to make sense. And I think it's just wasted effort. But towards the end, he's saying, let's see here, I'm thinking it has to do with the difference between absorption and full awareness jhanas, since there is a difference between experiencing jhana through deep concentration versus experiencing it because there aren't enough hindrances left to stop the jhana from arising. Well, I mean, I've covered this recently also. I don't know if Quasar asked the question, but just because you don't have the hindrances, it's not like the hindrances are like some dike or dam holding back jhana. That like suppressing the hindrances are a necessary, like they're, what's the word? I'm getting lost with words. They're like prerequisites. But I mean, just because you get rid of the hindrances temporarily doesn't mean that's what causes jhana. That's just a prerequisite before you can attain jhana. But just because you've done that doesn't mean it's just that the hindrances are like some kind of dam holding back jhana. It really doesn't work that way. So Quasar is assuming that there's two different kinds of jhana. There's the jhana when you're sitting motionless with your eyes closed, which, according to the legend, the Buddha as a kid, that's what he was doing, sitting motionless under a tree in meditation when he experienced first jhana and said, that's it. That's how to become enlightened. And it's just a confused legend. There may be some way of rationalizing it that will be emotionally satisfying to some people who want to believe that this legend is some kind of objective factual history. But I'm skeptical of that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is Quasar's second question. Now, and I will mention though, Quasar seems to imply that there is a kind of jhana that is there when you're just like an enlightened being who's walking around is just always in jhana. But I mean, that is not orthodox Theravada. You can come up with your own theories on jhana that, will be like in defiance of Orthodox Theravada. Like, for example, the Buddha, when he died, as he was dying, he was in such severe pain, he went into jhana. First, he went into first jhana, then second, then fourth, third, then fourth, then the formless jhanas in order, and then goes back down to first, and then goes up to fourth again, and then he passes away while he's in like ordinary fourth jhana, which is another little hint that the formless realms weren't part of the jhana scheme at the beginning. So they had to like tack those on, but then they had to like have him come back down out of that all the way back to first and then up to regular fourth again in order to go pass into parinibbana. So, I mean, really, if you start off with dogmatism, just starting off with the assumption that legends and entire suttas and so forth are just 100% accurate and factual and reliable, then you're just going to lock yourself into this dogmatic system that is going to have a lot of deadwood at best. Some of it's worse than deadwood. Some of it's actually detrimental to believe this stuff. So you have to be careful, and you should be skeptical in the classical sense of suspending judgment. You know, when you read something in a text, it's not a matter of, I believe this or this is bullshit. There's also like the alternative of just accepting it as a hypothesis. You're not insisting it's true. You're not insisting it's false. You're just considering it, maybe working with it a little, maybe accepting it provisionally to see how things work out from that. And with regard to some of these old legends, I mean, they're just irrelevant. Stuff like biological or biographical stuff about the Buddha's life, a lot of that, I mean, it really has nothing to do with Dhamma practice. Like whether Jesus's mother was a virgin or not should be just utterly irrelevant. You know, it's like, what did the man have to say? That's what's important. So for the second time, I think I'll leave this question and I'll move on to Quaesitor's second question, which is it possible to feel depressed in a heavenly realm, form or formless? I think it's possible, but it would be much more subtle than in the human realm. That no matter where you go, there's going to be like happiness and unhappiness. Even in the heaven realms, there's going to be happiness and unhappiness, because the first noble truth, you know, everything is dukkha. You know, the first noble truth is everybody suffers. You know, it's like existence has suffering built into it. Individual existence has suffering built right into it. There's no escape so long as you are existing as some kind of being. So even up in the higher heaven realms, there's going to be a certain amount of maybe mild boredom, mild restlessness, maybe a little mild depression, in the sense of just sort of your depression for me is often experienced as just like a contraction of spirit. Then you get more manic, it's more expansive, you know, expansion and contraction. So I don't see why a higher being, a superhuman being, could have some contraction of spirit, relatively speaking. It would be much more subtle than we're experiencing, just like, you know, the depression of the average human would be much more subtle than the depression of someone who is like some low-ranking ghost or like denizen of a hell realm or something. So yeah, it is possible, in my opinion. So I'll move on to Quaesitor's third question, which is it possible to leave that realm, or are you stuck there for a predetermined amount of time if you're constantly forming attachment to subtle sensation? Happy, I'd hate to think of the negative kamma you'd be accumulating and would have to pay back. So I don't fully understand this part. So, I mean, the main question is it possible to leave a heaven realm, or are you stuck there for a predetermined amount of time? Well, it seems like humans can commit, well, I shouldn't say the word. Humans can auto-terminate. They can choose to do that. I assume like superhuman beings might choose to do that for whatever reason. But I'm no authority on these realms because I cannot recall having been there. So let's see. Yeah, I think that if some deva really wanted to leave a deva realm and just be reborn, I mean, why would they want to be reborn somewhere else? I mean, want to go back to being a human? It's sort of like a human wanting to go back to being an animal or something. Maybe. I wouldn't say that it's absolutely impossible. In fact, I'd be hesitant to say that anything is absolutely impossible. But how common it is, I have no idea of saying. And I don't know if the Buddhist texts, at least the Pali Suttas, I don't know if they really address this issue. So his commentarial follow-up here is, if you're constantly forming attachment to subtle sensation, I'd hate to think of the negative karma you'd be accumulating and would have to pay back. Well, I mean, it would be a very subtle attachment, and it would be much more subtle than the attachment you're getting as a human to listening to good music or having good sex or eating good chocolate or whatever. So, I mean, the mental states are more subtle the higher up you go. So there's still going to be attachments and so forth. And I mean, if you're having happiness and you're got this subtle attachment to the happiness itself is meritorious. It's good karma to be happy. It's bad karma. I mean, it's all going to balance out, positive and negative. But I mean, when you're unhappy, that is essentially immoral by Buddhist ethical standards. Buddhist ethics are alien to the Western morality, which is either based on monotheism or it's based on like 19th century British, I almost said totalitarianism, utilitarianism, like Jeremy Bentham, somebody like that. Those are like the two main kinds of ethics that we have in the West. And Buddhism is just light years away in some respects. That it's based on psychology, not upon the will of God and not upon the effects of your actions on the masses around you. So you can have subtle attachment to good meditation too, but that doesn't mean that you're making a lot of bad karma and not making good karma that's going to compensate for that or even more than compensate for it. For example, if you're abiding in meditative bliss, you're going to be making some strong good karma for that. And you might also be making some subtle bad karma through your attachment to it or just feelings of superiority or whatever that you get because of this. But still, you're better off in a heaven realm than not in a heaven realm. Or you're better off having good meditation that you have some mild, subtle clinging to rather than just not having good meditation at all. So, let's see here. I mean, I'm tempted to answer Quasitor's fourth question just because, again, he's talking about sotapannas. Man, maybe, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, again, he's discussing my skepticism of, well, what the fuck? This is going to be a long one anyway. But really, try to keep questions down to no more than 3 per episode. Don't just obstinately throw in a 4th one, hoping that I will indulge you in your transgression. So can you please elaborate on which suttas, commentaries, and perhaps discrepancies or other factors lead you to believe that a sotapanna has not necessarily witnessed nibbana or that nibbana is never experienced? Well, in a way, this is like 2 questions. First of all, the whole 4 stages of sainthood, you can read it in G.C. Pandey's book, his reasons for why he thinks the 4 stages of Aryahood are an anachronism. For example, the oldest texts seem to like conflate an arahant with an anagami. a non-returner, you would think would be enlightened. And Sakadagamis aren't mentioned at all. Sotapannas in the early texts are generally, I mean, just from the context, it would appear that a Sotapanna originally was like a new convert to Buddhism, usually a layperson who monks were supposed to go easy on them, not ask for too much from them, for example, because that might cause their faith, their newfound faith, to falter. And then later on, according to my theory, the 4 stages of Aryahood were devised, and then it's like every time you become on one of these stages, every time you reach one of these 4 stages, you have this flash you have this glimpse of nirvana. And I mean, the glimpse of nirvana is acceptable to me, but I think Sotapanna originally just meant a new convert to Buddhism, like a born again Christian kind of. So it's a long question. Let's see. And also he's saying that, what caused me to think that Nibbana is not experienced. Well, from Orthodox Theravada, to experience anything, you have to perceive it. You cannot perceive Nibbana. A perception of Nibbana or Nirvana is delusional because the perception is infinitely different from what it is trying to represent. And I mean, I don't want to keep just wallowing in this just because it's already a transgressive 4th question. And also it's a 5th question because it's like asking 2 different things in the 4th question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the Arya Swasti Project. And the Arya Swasti Project says, have you ever heard or know of an instance or condition where someone is asleep? To themselves, they seem to awaken and can see everything in the room and they cannot move. People call it sleep paralysis. However, more often than not, there is an entity of some sort close by. This has happened to me many times and it is unnerving. And it just happened a few minutes ago. It is really difficult to rouse oneself from one of these. I should mention that this only occurs during the day. Do you have any explanation of what it is? And am I seeing the room, remember my eyes are closed, or imagining it? I guess that's 3. Well, I think probably the closest I have had to this kind of sleep paralysis that he's describing is the notorious time that I was attacked by ogres when I was living at Thabet Ain Doya in southern Burma. And I was hearing voices, hearing loud sounds coming from down the valley, and realized that I could not move at all. And so that was the fact that I could not move. My eyes were open, but I was like paralyzed. That would be a kind of sleep paralysis. Possibly one of the most famous cases of sleep paralysis is in Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan Karamazov, Ivan, is having his famous conversation with the devil. And at the end, he realizes he's paralyzed and he has to jolt himself. And then the devil disappears when he finally is able to move again. So the whole thing is kind of a vision. And it's built into human beings that when you're dreaming, you are paralyzed, because if the paralysis doesn't work, you start acting out your dreams, like sleepwalking. Sleepwalking is a kind of failure of sleep paralysis. So you have to be paralyzed when you're dreaming just so that you won't get up and start moving around or try to get up or, that kind of thing. So in a way, it's kind of a glitch in this reflex or mechanism that we have built into us, where you just can't move your muscles of your actual body when you're dreaming. Why it would only happen during the daytime, or why an entity would generally be perceived at the same time. Like one of the most common kinds of sleep paralysis experience is a kind of nightmare situation where you're on your back and there's some angry, dark, ghost-like entity pressing down on your chest and you can't move. My father had this happen to him when he was an old man. I've never had one of these before. I've read about these kind of cases before. And it's generally considered to be a kind of nightmare. It's sort of like an archetype. It's common in the human race, although people that are more paranormal in their thinking, they might think that it's some sort of evil entity or poltergeist or something like that. But let's see. What is the actual question here? Let's see. Is it really difficult to rouse? No, that's not a question. Do you have any explanation of what it is? Well, for starters, there is just the standard normal sleep paralysis that paralyzes us when we're dreaming. It can still sort of get stuck so that you can actually wake up and still be paralyzed. I have had bad dreams where, something bad is happening to me. I'm trying to get away and I can't move at all until finally it's just through this supreme effort of will. I just sort of like jerk myself, which actually jerks my body, and then I wake up. Maybe I shouldn't have said jerk myself. There's some people with dirty minds that might misinterpret that. But, just like trying to just suddenly move, just break myself free from this paralysis. And usually that would end the dream. But then I'm still dreaming, and it's all within the context of the dream. And it's not like I've begun to wake up, really. So are you seeing the room or imagining it? Well, ultimately there is no room. Ultimately it's kind of illusory anyway. But in my case, when I was supposedly attacked by ogres, I'm fairly sure that my eyes were open. Like I was propped up like this. I was lying on my side, propping up my head to look down the valley to see if the sun was coming up, because I didn't have a clock or a watch or anything. And I just went for alms round at dawn. So I was checking to see if it was dawn. And then that's when I started hearing the weird noises and so forth. And then I realized that I couldn't move. I was just stuck, like my head propped up like this, kind of looking towards the horizon. So if your eyes are closed and you think you're seeing the room, probably you're not. It's probably you're dreaming and you're seeing the room. There's a lot of weird experiences. I've talked to a meditator at Pa'audoya who was working on like visualizing the internal organs of the person sitting in front of him. And he's sitting there and he's visualizing the skeletal structure and everything. And then he opens his eyes when he's done. He realized the person got up and left long before he was finished. And he told his teacher, the teacher says, it's not important. But still, he thinks he's using the samadhi eye to look into the body of the person in front of him and seeing the skeletal structure. And then he opens his eyes and there's nobody there. He thinks there's somebody there that he's looking at their bones, but the person wasn't even sitting there anymore. So it's just vivid imagination in that case. And when you're dreaming, as a general rule, you can't tell the difference between reality, so-called reality, waking reality, and the dream. So, yeah, I think it can go either way in that case. The paralysis part and the dreaming can continue even after your eyes are open. So it may be, it can happen with eyes open or closed, in which case, if your eyes are closed, you're dreaming that you're seeing it. And if your eyes are open, it's just a higher level of dream because we're in a state of consensus trance right now anyway. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey says, "Hey, Santa Claus Buddha, could I get a beautiful wife that isn't crazy and doesn't trust the government medical system or try to get me to go to church or therapy? It's okay if she thinks we're on a spinning ball zooming 666,000 miles per hour around the sun and that someone drove a dune buggy on the moon, even if she votes. I would like her to enjoy cooking and cleaning, never gets tired of loving me, have a lovely voice, no physical ailments or weird characteristics, always laughs at my jokes, doesn't talk too much, does what I tell her to, and never speak ill of me." Well, yeah, if you find her, she's probably going to be riding a unicorn. But it is possible, and if you've got the karma to come meet such a woman and actually attract such a woman, because if women like this are hard to come by, everybody's going to have some kind of, something like, here's like, always laughs at your jokes. Well, no physical ailments or weird characteristics. I mean, that's just unrealistic. I mean, if you want to understand women, the best thing you could possibly watch on YouTube for understanding women is just look up Hot Crazy Matrix on YouTube. Hot Crazy Matrix, 3 words, you'll find the video. And it points out that on a scale of 1 to 10, all women are at least a 4 crazy. That's important to bear in mind. It's helped me a lot in life. Just realize, I mean, you're not going to find a woman who's below a 4 with regard to general insanity. So, yeah, I mean, you're going to have to make some compromises, especially if you yourself are not the perfect man. So for like the average guy, or Jeffrey here probably isn't average, but still, for like a guy to be like insisting on the perfect woman, whereas the perfect woman, I mean, she can choose any guy there is out there, because she's one of the extremely few perfect women, maybe the only one. So if the only perfect woman on earth, why would she pick Jeffrey? See, that's the thing. It's like you gotta have some realism, and also bear in mind that if you aren't perfect, you shouldn't be insisting on the perfect mate, other than perfectly suited to you, which even then could be a fair amount of dysfunction. Like some people, I was talking to my sweetheart recently about this. Some people, they're in a relationship and they're fighting all the time, but I mean, the fight is coming from inside them. It's like, it may be the perfect mate for them is someone they're going to be fighting with, because they got all this fight that's got to come out. They got to fight with someone, might as well be someone who likes fighting back with them. So, I mean, when we're living in an imperfect world, you got to deal with all these weird like quirks and imperfections and so forth that are just part of the practice, really. It's like accepting another person's imperfections, or even better than, I mean, imperfections are like mind-made. So, like if you love somebody perfectly, your love for that person makes them perfect. If you love somebody perfectly, they're perfect, because imperfections are like perceived flaws. You don't perceive any flaws, then they're perfect. And it's not even like you're blinding yourself. Like, let's say, she has some weird habit. She licks, well, no, people don't lick stamps anymore. She just has this, she bites her toenails, let's say. And no, my woman doesn't bite her toenails. But, she's got this quirk. And I mean, if you just don't see that as a fault, she's got a speech impediment. If you don't see that as a fault, it's not a fault. She's got sagging breasts. If you don't see that as a fault, they sag perfectly. So it's just a matter of attitude. And whether you can accept a person as they are or not is largely a reflection on your own capacity for love. I mean, if you're really fussy about who you're willing to accept, chances are it's not going to work out very well. And that's kind of like the way love works in like Hollywood. You got all these beautiful plastic people. They're beautiful on the outside anyway. And, it's all superficial. And then they've got like these actual personality traits just fucking things up because, they're so superficial. They can't really deal with anything deeper. And they just wind up getting a divorce 6 months after they got married because they just can't accept the way the other person does whatever it is they're doing. But it is possible. Anything is possible. But I wouldn't really be too insistent on getting Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, to fall in love with you and be completely faithful to you. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Poe. And this is kind of an easy one. It's actually a double question. Some people, they'll ask 2 questions in one, and then they're actually asking 2 questions. I notice these things. So Master Poe says, did you happen to catch Tom Campbell on Rogan? No, I didn't. I don't even know who Tom Campbell is. So that was an easy one. I can just move right on to Master Poe's second question. And have you ever heard of Arthur Blessit, a Christian who walked all over the world carrying a huge cross, spreading the gospel? I ask because he's been to Burma too. I wonder if there's a tall tale about a man and his cross. I brought him up because he passed on January 14th, 1925, and then he's got an 84 after that. I don't know what the 84 represents. And then he says, a modern day St. John of the Cross. He's one of the few men that I've admired. And I think I've heard of Arthur Blessit, but that's pretty much all I know about Arthur Blessit. It was what Master Po just told me in the follow-up commentary to his question. And I never heard of any like weird Western Christians dragging or carrying crosses around Burma. That the only legendary white person that I really heard much about in Burma was an Italian monk who lived in Burma like during the 1930s and 40s. And he actually walked from Burma to Bodh Gaya and back again, because it was all part of the British Empire back then. And I think he was put into a concentration camp by the British because he was Italian during World War II. He was on the bad guy side, and he was a serious monk, and he wouldn't stay at monasteries because monasteries, you know, the monks don't follow rules. You break rules just by setting foot on a monastery. So he would just stay at like public rest houses. You know, there's these buildings called zayat in Burma. It's just like a thatched roof, sometimes a corrugated metal roof just on poles with like a raised platform. People can sit in the shade. And so a monk can sleep there if he wants to. So that's what this Italian monk was doing. I don't even remember what his name was, but he was relatively famous. And that's like the only famous Westerner that you really hear much about in Burma, at least. Other than just like famous people like Donald Trump or something that don't go to Burma. But of the people that were in Burma, famous Westerners, yeah, that Italian monk was probably the only one I really heard much about, at least the only one that I can think of at present. Never heard of Arthur Blessit carrying a cross around Burma. Nobody ever told me about that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Thermal Squid. And he says, in respect to self-deletion, what about wherein the monk who struggles to maintain fourth jhana, who slits his own throat in frustration, that would be Godika in the Godika Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya. The texts say that the Buddha had said that he had reached the unconditioned. Yeah, and that was sort of, I've thought about this because in other places, the Buddha says a monk should not auto-terminate unless he has already attained what he has to attain, which means he's already become enlightened. He's already become an arahant. Then it doesn't matter so much. But you don't want to like terminate yourself before you get to the final goal. And then Godika in the Godika Sutta, he becomes enlightened at the moment of auto-termination. So that was sort of an exception to the rule, I guess, because it went against what the Buddha himself said pretty much, although it turned out that he wound up, becoming enlightened anyway. But I think most people who do auto-terminate are not planning on becoming enlightened at the moment of death. So still, you're better off becoming enlightened if you can before doing such a thing. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Siovakchen Sipad Zidana. And he says, next sutta video when? And that's kind of an easy one because the correct answer is, I don't know. Although I may be doing a video fairly soon with my friend Otto Excelsior on multidimensionality, which may not mention any suttas at all, but at least it'll be a video that isn't a Q&A video. So I'm just going to move on to Siovakchen Sipad Zidana's second question. Thoughts on the parable of the workers in the vineyard. It obviously does not seem to fit the Buddhist worldview due to past lives and karma, though, but I'm still curious what you think about it personally. I'm a little rusty on my New Testament, but if I remember correctly, I would guess the parables of the workers in the vineyard is the parable where these workers in the vineyard are being paid a certain rate. They're being paid one piece of silver, let's say. I don't remember how much they were getting paid. And it wasn't enough. There wasn't enough workers. So halfway through the day, they go out and find some more workers to work in the same vineyard. And they're getting the same pay as the earlier ones. And finally get to the 11th hour. They're almost done, but still they want more workers. And so they're paying the full piece of silver to everybody, including the people that are only going to work for like an hour. And so some of the earlier people are getting pissed because they're working all day and they're getting paid the same as these people who just showed up and they're almost done. So that was like a parable for salvation where, presumably mostly Jews were going to be saved. And then you got like these pagans who are converting to Christianity like right before the world ends, which was going to happen approximately 2,000 years ago. This is the final hour, says St. John the Evangelist in one of his, I assume it would be his first epistle. So is the salvation, the parable is the salvation is the same. If you're going to go to heaven, you're going to go to heaven regardless of whether you've been God's chosen people for thousands of years, or you're just some Greek pagan who signs up, just a few years before the world comes to an end, which Christians were expecting to happen anytime. So, you could somewhat apply this to Buddhism, where it's like people who have been like striving spiritually lifetime after lifetime get the same enlightenment as someone who just, he almost gets poisoned while riding a bus in Thailand, has a near-death experience, and that just slams him into enlightenment. It's the same enlightenment. Maybe the person who was striving spiritually lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, they'd probably have more sophisticated psychic powers and so forth. But still, one arahant equals another arahant. They both have zero delusion. So I guess you could kind of work that in to Buddhism. Although, the main point was that, Jesus was apparently comparing the Jews who had been worshiping the correct God for a long time and comparing that to like some Greek who just converts over to Judaism because in Jesus's time, what he was teaching was essentially a kind of Judaism. And then he gets saved even though, he just joined the bandwagon. So, I guess you could do that with Buddhism too, unless I'm just confusing my parables and Siovakshana was referring to a different one. And so Siovakshana next question is, please give us a tour of the house. And I'm not going to do that. Although I will say that our living room has really high ceilings, which is nice. I've always liked high ceilings. This house has the highest ceilings of any house that I've ever really lived in, which is nice. I've stayed temporarily in houses with like a 2-story house with the living room was like 2 stories high. The ceiling was like way the hell up there. But I didn't, I might have spent a few nights there, but this is the first house I've really lived in like long term. And it's got ceilings like probably at least 16 feet high in the living room, which is nice. Also has a fireplace, but it's a fake fireplace with fake fire from like fake logs with like natural gas coming through the cracks in the logs. So that's kind of lame, I have to admit. Also, we've got this tiny little postage stamp of a front yard, and the backyard's hardly any bigger. But at least it cuts back on the amount of yard work that has to be done. But no, you're not going to get a tour of the house. That's not going to happen. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid says, how do we get better at dealing with loneliness? And then he's got the commentary here. Someday I want to be able to live alone in a forest with no friends, family, or romantic partner and be completely happy on my own, but being alone is really hard for me. I always have the TV on or a YouTube video playing. to keep me company, and the desire to have a girlfriend is constantly gnawing at me. It feels like my actions or time are made necessarily less valuable if I'm not sharing them with others and gaining their approval or affection or companionship, even though I don't logically believe this to be the case. I recognize that these desires are not self-evident, not necessary courses of suffering, and ultimately delusional, but it's still difficult to get around them. And this is another kind of question that I really can't answer based upon my own experience, because I've always been a loner. My father says when I was a little kid, like 2 years old, just a little toddler, I'd be like sitting on the steps of our house in the dark, just sitting there motionless in the dark. Just, I don't know why. So, yeah, I mean, I've always been kind of a loner. I was pretty much of a hermit before I became a monk. I've had friends, but never, I mean, not since college anyway, have I had like really close friends where, you know, you're like going over to each other's houses all the time. You know, people, you know, they come to your house a lot, you go to their house a lot and stuff like that. I mean, my woman and I, we've invited very few people into our house since we've been together. Neither one of us is particularly social. Being with a woman that you love is, I mean, it can be pretty much the same as being alone. You feel kind of similar to when you're alone. It's just like they're so easily accepted that it's not like you've got anyone kind of impinging on your space or anything like that, because you're sharing the same space essentially. And some people are just, they've just got it built into them. They're just gregarious by instinct or something. And like in Burma, it was like even a famous hermit would always have at least one attendant living with him, and he'd be like accepting visitors every day, that kind of thing. And I remember I was staying at a big school monastery that the one rains retreat I spent there, it was like 1,500 people living there, monks and novices. And I had a cabin all to myself. It was surrounded by other cabins, but I was the only person living in this cabin. And a lot of the Burmese people were just amazed. How can you live alone like this when I'm just surrounded by hundreds of other people? It's just that this one cabin, which has got other cabins just like 10 feet on either side of it. And I mean, it was a little too many people for my tastes, but the Burmese were thinking it was just like this exceptional, like, solitude that I was living in. So, yeah, I can't really relate to like always wanting to be like in a social setting, like being surrounded by other people. But I mean, you've got two options. I mean, you can kind of make peace with that and just live in a group setting, like a communal kind of situation, which there's nothing wrong with that. Or you can just kind of go against your own nature, which is going to result in a certain amount of frustration and unhappiness. But if you think it's worth it, if you think you really need to learn how to be alone, then you might be best off just forcing yourself. Like what I did before I became a monk, I moved to a town where I didn't know anybody and just kind of kept to myself. I didn't have people like pestering me all the time because nobody knew me. So, I mean, you could do something like that, and then you'll be listening to the radio or like watching YouTube videos or something. But yeah, it's one thing you can do is just be mindful. Just try to observe your feelings of loneliness. Try to understand that so you can understand it better, and understanding it better helps you to transcend it to some degree. But really, it does seem like your two options are just make peace with your need for human companionship and just live in a communal house or something with roommates and all that, or a commune, or you're just going to have to like go cold turkey, I guess, and just force yourself to learn to live alone. Those would be like your two options as I see it. And I don't think you're necessarily going wrong either way, although it may be that forcing yourself to live alone when it goes against your nature might result in a lot of unhappiness. But if you think the unhappiness is worthwhile, that it's something that you really need to learn, then that's what you're gonna do. But yeah, it's something I can't really relate to very well. And that's one reason why in the West, it's one reason why people say that lay teachers are often more effective than monk teachers, because lay teachers can relate to the problems of other lay people, whereas monks are like celibate and just like uncompromisingly saintly in certain respects, and they just can't really relate to the problems of the layperson coming to them. But even though I'm technically a layperson now, I still can't really relate to a need for human companionship, since I have been a loner since I was little. I've just, like I was saying earlier on, I do prefer the company of trees and animals as a general rule for most of my life to the company of humans, although I am kind of softening up towards humans in my later years. But I mean, you're kind of stuck being who you are. Struggling against who you are is a rough one. And Krishnamurti would warn against that. That was like one of his main teachings. Don't struggle against who and what you are, because, I mean, chances are you're going to lose. You're going to lose the struggle because you're stuck being who you are. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's next question here. Can you recommend some suttas to read where the Buddha goes over how mindfulness works and how to do it properly, preferably early ones that are more likely to be what he really taught? Well, I mean, the classic text on mindfulness is the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. There's two Satipatthana Suttas. They're almost identical. I think the only real difference between the two is the Maha or Great Satipatthana Sutta has like an explanation of the Four Noble Truths in it. But aside from that, they're essentially the same sutta. And they're relatively old and are probably based on even older material. Like G.C. Pandey, his theory is that the Satipatthana and Mahasatipatthana Suttas were like compendiums of these different instructions on meditation, just possibly taken from various sources and just compiled into like this collection of meditation instructions on various kinds of meditation, and all of it being mindfulness of some sort or another, satipatthana. So yeah, I mean, the main sutta to read with regard to mindfulness, how it works and so forth, is the one of the Satipatthana Suttas. Mahasatipatthana is in the Digha Nikaya, and the regular Satipatthana is in the Majjhima Nikaya. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. From Xenothoid. And he says, what is your opinion on Albert Camus and the philosophy of absurdism? I think Camus would have made for a good Buddhist. Well, I mean, I have read some of Camus' fiction, and he's often considered to be an existentialist. He was big back when existentialism was at its peak, I think. And maybe absurdism is just sort of like a subsect of existentialism. I've also read Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, which is one of the lamest philosophical books I ever read. I think the whole point of the book, the main theme of it, is we shouldn't auto-terminate just out of spite. Just out of spite against the cosmos. We should just stubbornly remain alive. That was like his profound explanation of why we should not auto-terminate. But, I mean, he was pretty much of an existentialist, even though you might call him an absurdist. You know, to exist is absurd, or existentialism is, you know, it's like to exist is meaningless, and we just attribute whatever meaning we want to it, whatever we think is best. So, yeah, I mean, some of what he wrote is kind of stressing the absurd aspect of life, just kind of the pointlessness of it. And I'm not so sure he would have made a good Buddhist. I think he might have been just too skeptical and kind of cynical to have really taken Buddhism seriously. And I've pretty much wiped out my first beverage here, which has been failing at lubricating my throat, as you may have noticed. So I may have to crack the emergency backup beverage very soon here. So, yeah, getting back to Albert Camus. Yeah, I think he died in an absurd way, too. I think he just died in like a freak car accident or something. But I do not consider him to have been a particularly profound thinker. As existentialists go, I think there are probably several that were deeper than him. Like Kierkegaard. I never read anything by Kierkegaard, but he does have a reputation for being kind of a proto-existentialist who was a profound thinker. Karl Jaspers, again, I never read anything by Karl Jaspers, but he seems to have gone in a good direction towards the end because he turned to mysticism. You know, mysticism is like the answer to existentialism, unless you're this eccentric English monk named Jnanavira who lived in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, as it was called back then, back in the 50s and early 60s, who thought that existentialism, the only answer to existentialism was Buddhism, but he had such a complicated, just hyper-rationalistic, hyper-intellectual understanding of Theravada Buddhism that, you'd have to be some sort of professional logician even to understand what he's teaching. And I really need to open up the emergency backup beverage because I got like this tickle in my throat. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Arpad. And Arpad says, what kind of meditation can be practiced lying down with pros and cons? Oh, I didn't separate his questions, so I got to separate them. Okay. So, what kind of meditation can be practiced lying down with pros and cons? Any kind of meditation can be practiced lying down. You can be mindful of your breath while lying down. You can be contemplating death while lying down. You could be looking at a casino, especially if you got it on the ceiling while lying down. You can be practicing any kind of mindfulness meditation while lying down. Just any kind of meditation that you can practice sitting, you can also practice while lying down, unless it's just meditation on the posture of sitting, which is not a very profound meditation technique anyway. But the main disadvantage is that you're much more likely to be drowsy or sleepy or just flat out fall asleep because you're lying down. Like I mentioned it might have been the previous Q&A. If it wasn't the previous one, it was the one before that. How to avoid being sleepy when you're meditating is just have like this ramrod straight posture. A very alert posture helps you to stay alert. And if you're in a sleepy kind of posture, like lying down, it's much more conducive to being sleepy. So that's the main thing. I experimented a little bit with using a rosary, just lying on my back, just using my thumb to work through a rosary. I experimented with that briefly, and it didn't seem to work very well. I just not really a rosary kind of person, or a mala person, I should say. So I don't think there really are any pros to meditating while lying down, which is why lying down meditation is rarely taught by anybody, because there are very few advantages to it. And the main disadvantage is it's more conducive to sleepiness and less alertness than if you are standing up or walking or sitting straight up and down in the full lotus posture. So I'm just going to move on to Arpad's second question. If the 5 remembrances just make me sad instead of furthering detachment, should I stop doing them? Well, if you're not getting benefit from doing the 5 remembrances, in offhand, I'd be guessing at what exactly all 5 remembrances are. But it's my understanding that they're recollections of like your own merit and the gods, the virtues of the Buddha and so forth. And I mean, they're relatively elementary level meditations anyway, as a general rule. I don't know why they would necessarily make you sad, but clearly, if you're trying to do a meditation method and you're not making progress, and in fact, it might even be like having a detrimental effect on you, then you should try something else. So yeah, I'm not sure why the 5 remembrances would just make you sad, but instead of furthering detachment. But I mean, if it's not working, try something else. I mean, that's just common sense. So I'm just going to move on to Arpad's third question, which is, what have you learned or understood through meditation that you wouldn't have otherwise? Well, one of the main insights that I got from meditation is that, when you stop thinking, you don't just disappear. You don't just become unconscious. That in a way, it's more, you're closer to reality without thinking than when you are thinking. And a lot of people, especially people who are addicted to thinking, would just think it's like your personality would disappear. It'd be like death, there'd be nobody there. But really, if you're wide awake and not thinking anything, you're closer to reality and you're more awake than otherwise. It's like you don't die. Nothing really disappears other than temporarily some thinking that isn't really all that valuable disappears. So, yeah, that would be like the main insight that I got through meditation, at least that can be expressed into words easily. Another thing that you learn very quickly when you meditate that you wouldn't learn if you didn't meditate is just how hard it is to control your thoughts. A lot of people, they never try to meditate. They never try to go against the stream. And so they think, I can control my thoughts. I can think about whatever I want to think about. But when you're actually just trying to focus your thoughts on just the sensation of touch at the nostrils as the air is going in and out, without thinking about other stuff, you realize that you've got monkey mind. And I mean, you realize just how little actual control you have got over your own thoughts, or what you think are your own thoughts, when really you have damn little control over them. You can kind of steer them this way or that way, but you really don't even have much control over what you decide, what direction you decide to take. So that's a basic insight that people can learn very quickly at their very first meditation retreat, or their very first attempts at meditation, is that what you think, the control you think you have over your mind is largely illusory. So there's probably other ones, but if I racked my brains, tried to come up with a list, I could. But considering the huge number of questions we've got, I think I'd better move on to the next question, which is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libralam and occasionally still known as Libralam. And he says, how would you recommend one to reconcile staying proactive in life and paying respect to the multifaceted nature of transitoriness it covers, what one is identifying with, plans they make, desires or wishes they have, actions they take, and their sense of what fruitful results even are? In other words, how do we find our North Star standing on shifting grounds? Well, if you've got a goal, that can be your North Star. But really, this is kind of like an artificial problem to me. It kind of strikes me that way. Obviously things are changing, and sometimes you just take like a transitory approach. It's like if you're dancing, for example. I'm not recommending anybody start dancing, but if you're dancing, you're just in this flow. It's like everything is in flux, really. The floor remains a constant, I suppose. There are some constants, but still, the music is changing, your body is changing, everyone around you is changing, the flashing lights, like reflecting off the disco ball, it's all changing, and still there's just, you don't even really have this unified goal while you're dancing. You're just dancing, you're just going with the flow. It's just this flux. And you can go through life that way, and I think a lot of people do. It's overthinking becomes a problem. How many conscious beings have a problem with trying to reconcile staying proactive and paying respect to the multifaceted nature of transitoriness. I mean, you just accept the way things are. This is the way it is. And if you have any kind of goal or like priorities, then you work towards those goals or those priorities. And I mean, that's it. I mean, things will be changing. Other things will be staying relatively constant. I mean, there always has to be a balance between like stasis and change. That's, for me, that's a good example of my understanding of dependent co-arising. That you have to have some things staying the same and other things changing. If everything stays the same, that's death, that's stasis. I mean, time doesn't even pass really because there's no events to measure time. You know, there's not even a ticking of a clock. But I mean, if everything's changing, you've just got chaos. You know, nothing stays the same. Then, you know, it's just all meaning is lost. So, I mean, we're just in this situation. This is just the way it is. And so you do the best you can. I mean, it's like the only stellar supreme, formerly known as Liberlam and sometimes still known as Liberlam, can come up with a problem like this because he is so cerebral in his approach to life that he's like finding problems that most beings in this universe, it never occurs to them to see any problem. So, let's see. It covers what one is identifying with, plans they make, desires or wishes they have, actions they take, and their sense of what fruitful results even are. In other words, how do we find our North Star standing on shifting grounds? I mean, for the most part, your karma is driving you through this anyway. And then if you don't have any karma anymore, then it just stops. Nothing is like impelling you through samsara. But really, I'm not good at advising with regard to stuff like this. I mean, it's a problem that it would never occur to me to see as a problem. It's like you think too much, and so you're dredging up problems that don't necessarily really exist. How do you do this? I mean, you just do it. I mean, you've been doing it your whole life, I assume. So let's see here. I guess I better just move on. I'm getting questions this time that I can't relate to very well. Just because I just don't function that way. Like being lonely. I mean, when I was a monk, sometimes I have this one friend named Mucus Man that I would miss more than anyone else, really. Him and my father, I guess. You know, it'd be so nice to just hang out with him. I'd be sitting under a rock ledge out in a forest somewhere, just thinking, man, it'd be nice to hang out with Mucus Man. But as a general rule, I was pretty cool with just being alone. So when I get questions like, how do you deal with loneliness? It's like, I don't know. Just observe it mindfully. Like that would be like the standard Buddhist answer right there. Observe it, note it. So anyways, getting back to Raphael, who is asking the next question. He says, your thoughts on this quote of Ajahn Martin? And I think Ajahn Martin has the Pali name of Piadamo. And he's on YouTube. And I think he's German. And he's not the only German Piadamo, because I used to know this other German monk named Piadamo that I thought was Ajahn Martin at first, but it turns out that it's a different German monk named Piadamo. Anyways, Raphael says, your thoughts on this quote of Ajahn Martin? And then Ajahn Martin says, and I quote, consciousness or vijnana is one of the khandhas and of course is not eternal. The citta is eternal. Just remember what the Lord Buddha said, the Tathagata after dead neither is nor is not. The citta is not individualistic nor personal. How could the Lord Buddha talk to Ajahn Man presenting Dhamma to him in the form of the Lord Buddha if there is nothing that is eternal and everything dies away? We grasp the term citta wrongly. We think every being has a citta. No, that is not right. Every being is part of that one citta that is eternal. This would be the correct view, unquote. And from an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, this is just shameless heresy. And this runs amok, especially in the Thai forest tradition. I'm not exactly sure why, but the Thai forest tradition has this kind of crypto self view where they're saying, there's this eternal mind that is the one that knows. And it's essentially like Vedanta, where you've got the Atman is Brahman, that, it's like God pervades the universe, and our soul, our Atman, is just that aspect of God that just happens to be localized here, but really it's all part of this same undifferentiated infinite consciousness kind of stuff. And it may be that Thai Buddhism still has some like vestigial lingering effects of Mahayana Buddhism or Hinduism that have caused so many Thai Ajahns to be spouting this clear heresy from an orthodox Buddhist point of view. Nowhere does the Buddha say that citta is eternal, that mind is eternal. Nowhere. It's not in the suttas. Even the Upanishadic approach to reality is shot down in the suttas, where, you've got this eternal consciousness, or like formless eternal consciousness, which some pre-Theravadan philosophy may have supported. But I do think it is wise that early Buddhism adopted this idea of essentially apophatic spirituality, where I didn't really explain what apophatic meant when I was answering the question about apophatic theology. It's just reality cannot be expressed in words. And so I think early Buddhism took this seriously, like the Atthakavagga, this you do not make assertions, because any assertion is going to be delusional, because reality cannot be expressed in words. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. So, and with regard to the Buddha talking to Ajahn Mun, I mean, that's just a scandal. In Ajahn Mun's autobiography, or maybe it was his biography that was written by Ajahn Mahabua, and Ajahn Mun was considered to be an arahant. Ajahn Mahabua also was considered to be an arahant. And so monks in Thai traditions especially take this biography very seriously. And some of the stuff in this biography is just wildly heretical, just like blatantly delusional wrong view from an orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view. For example, Ajahn Mun was having just multitudes of Buddhas and retinues of thousands of arahant disciples, all of them dead, coming to visit him to discuss Dhamma. And that's just, I mean, one time I hinted to a monk who had been ordained in a Thai tradition that, that sounds a little bit psychotic. And he said, "Don't say that, Bhante. Don't even think it." Because, it's like Ajahn Mun is just like this axiom. Ajahn Mun was an arahant, and Ajahn Mun ate cheese in the afternoon, so it's okay for Thai monks to eat cheese in the afternoon. Ajahn Mun was a chain smoker. He was literally a drug addict. It's okay to smoke tobacco in Thai Buddhism because Ajahn Mun did it. And if he was an arahant and he could do that, if it's good enough for Ajahn Mun, it's good enough for anybody. But seriously, this idea that the citta is eternal, I double dog dare you to find a passage in the suttas that says the citta is eternal, unless maybe it's that obscure text that is describing nirvana as infinite, formless, unmanifest consciousness. Or maybe like in the Gautika Sutta, where Mara, the evil one, is searching for the consciousness of Gautika after he passes away. And the Buddha says he's not going to find it because Gautika's consciousness has become unmanifest. So you can kind of, it's like I was saying earlier, where there's different ways of interpreting things, there's different ways of climbing the same mountain, but the early Buddhist way is you do not reify the absolute. You cannot put ultimate reality in words. It's just skillful means. You have to use like Vihara Desana, which is the language of normies, to try to influence the minds of normies. Or if you're a human, you've got to use some kind of human language just as a way of, just thinking things that sometimes you just got to think things. But to assume that it's real is delusion. And for some reason, the Thai forest tradition has this kind of self-view, which ultimately is not endorsed in Orthodox Theravada and is heretical wrong view. And I mean, if they were like Vedantist Hindus, it would be fine. And they want to think, well, Theravada is wrong here, or I just prefer to use a different paradigm than Theravada in this case. At least that would be honest. But for them to try to like twist and distort Orthodox Theravada teachings to saying the Buddha taught this when really he didn't. I mean, that's, it happens a lot that monks, and a lot of them are in Thai traditions, they'll try to justify or rationalize deviations from Orthodox Theravada by saying, well, it's really Orthodox. They won't admit that it's not Orthodox, like monks eating cheese in the afternoon. I mean, the real reason why Thai monks think eating cheese in the afternoon is okay, Ajahn monk ate cheese in the afternoon. He was an arhat. That's the real argument. But then you've got monks like Ajahn Thanisaro trying to say that, well, in ancient India, people made butter differently than they make it now. And really, what we call cheese is actually a kind of butter. And that was his justification. I mean, it's like just really reaching, trying to just do anything you can to make what you want to be orthodox or right, when the honest thing to do is just to say cheese is hardened curd. I mean, in Burmese, the word for cheese literally is denge, which means hardened curd. And curd is not allowable. They had curd in ancient India, not allowable in the afternoon. And since cheese is like purified curd, it's like curd that has some of the excess whey like pressed out of it. Maybe a little bit of bacterial culture or something, but it's more pure curd than curd is. And then to say that is really butter, I mean, they just want to eat cheese in the afternoon. And using any kind of arguments like it's sophistry. It's like they're trying to rationalize what they've been taught by their teachers. They don't want to doubt their teachers. They got reverence for their teachers. They know their teachers were wise men, and so they just assume they're right. And so they'll prefer what their teacher says to what the suttas say. And if you do that, I mean, at least you're still being honest if you acknowledge that. But when you start saying that the teacher who's teaching this stuff that's just flagrantly in like just flouting what the suttas teach, and you're just saying, well, the suttas do teach it, or at least, the Buddha didn't say that it's flat out false, that kind of stuff, they're trying to force fit it into orthodoxy. You're getting into the realm of dishonesty. And I really do not want to just call these Thai Ajahns who insist that consciousness, that the citta mind is eternal, that they're all just dishonest people. I mean, they've got their justifications and their rationalizations, and some of them just don't know the suttas very well. But still, again, I mean, if they were Vedantist Hindus or even some sects of Mahayana Buddhists, it wouldn't be so bad, because at least they'd be in harmony with what their own scriptures say. But the Pali texts do not say that the mind is eternal, unless it's these really obscure texts that really are not mainstream and just don't fit into orthodoxy. And I don't even think that the Thai Ajahns are even referring to that. So I think I'm just going to discontinue this mild rant and move on to the next question. This is from Kundru. And Kundru says, have you read the novel Journey to the West? If so, what are your thoughts on it? And Journey to the West is a novel by Hermann Hesse. I think in German it has some interesting name like Das Morgenland Fahrt. And when I was in my early 20s, I went through a phase of reading Hermann Hesse novels. And it included Journey to the West. I may have read it like on a Japanese fishing vessel back in those days when I was working on Japanese ships. And I don't recall it extremely clearly. It was not one of Hesse's novels that really impressed me all that much. Maybe I should read it again. Maybe it would impress me more if I read it again. When you're reading something on a ship that's like rocking back and forth and your inner ears kind of in a little bit of chaotic motion or whatever, and you can't really concentrate as well as if you're like alone in a cave. But Journey to the West, yeah, I mean, it really did not make any like major impression on me. Of Hermann Hesse's novels, the one that I liked the most was actually Steppenwolf, not Siddhartha, like a lot of people might suspect, me being a Buddhist and all. But Steppenwolf was a good one. I liked that one. But Journey to the West, no, I think it was Journey to the East. Well, okay. So this might even be a different novel because Hesse's novel is The Journey to the East. And here we've got a novel called Journey to the West. And I've never even heard of that one, unless Kundra is confusing East with West. But, I mean, I have read the novel. I read it in my early 20s, which was considerable time ago, more than half my lifetime ago. And, yeah, I don't remember many details. I remember it was towards the end he had to receive some kind of punishment. And so it was like the first offer him the option of you have to tame a wild dog. And he didn't want to do that. So then his second choice was, all right, if you don't want to tame the wild dog, then you have to let one of your teachers give his honest opinion of your faults. And he realized that they're going to get harder and harder. You know, if he passes one, the next one's going to be worse. So he says, okay, I'll take that one. When really it seems to me like, I mean, that wouldn't be nearly as bad as taming a wild dog. But I mean, some people enjoy taming wild dogs. I think I might actually enjoy it too, depending on the dog, I guess. But yeah, Journey to the West, I've never even heard of a novel called Journey to the West. I think he might be referring to Journey to the East. Anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yuga'u. And let's see here. We've been going for, yeah, I hope I'm at least halfway done. I would assume few of you hope that I'm at least halfway done too, but you can look. You already know how long this thing's going to last. I don't know yet. You have that advantage over me. So, Yuga'u says, I have one meditation question. It would be nice if you could answer me here. I have been, just a minute here. My mustache is getting so long and shaggy that it's getting into my mouth sometimes. We're still doing it. I go like this. Okay. Yuga'u says, I have one meditation question. It would be nice if you could answer me here. I have been doing breath meditation, and over the past months, I can enter a state where my body feels light and filled with joy that brings a smile on my face. My question is, should that become object of my meditation, or should I go back to the breath? I really like to abide in that nice feeling. Well, it depends on what your priorities are and what kind of meditation. Like if you're doing like samatha meditation, you're trying to cultivate jhana, then you should just stay with the breath. If it wanders away into like enjoying these feelings of piti or rapture or whatever, just bring it back to the breath. On the other hand, if you're doing like vipassana meditation, mindfulness meditation, satipatthana, then whatever is the most obvious, whatever is the most obtrusive perception, then you're fine with just moving to that. And then you can understand you just feel what the pleasure feels like. Don't just wallow in it, obviously. But I mean, you should be observing whatever it is that is like the primary object, which is like the most obvious thing in your sensorium. Whatever is most obvious, whatever is most noticeable, that's what you notice. And like the pleasure, you don't just wallow in it, you're like observing it objectively, no matter what it is, with detachment. So you'd have to observe the pleasure and joy with detachment, which may not be easy to do. And if you really can't manage that, then you'd probably be better off staying with the breath anyway. And I think I'm just going to move on to Yuga-U's next question. While meditating, a thought occurred to me. Maybe it shared fear from, While meditating, a thought occurred to me. Maybe it's shared fear from many, where Stargate AI is used like a big data collector of each habits and tendencies of people. It's become so correct in it that it became a god-like, indisputable. We have preemptive arrests, selective pregnancies, sick are denied medication cause they will die anyway, controlled elections, big brother kind of control. Can this be just a bad dream? Well, that kind of dystopia, I mean, some people wouldn't even consider it to be a dystopia, but that kind of dystopia, it's unlikely. I mean, if computers become that, that intelligent, then, I don't see why they're going to bother with even having people around. I mean, what would be the point of even keeping people when the computer is that advanced and just gets along fine on its own? So let's see here. AI is used like a big data collector. So it'd be spying on everybody. You know, everybody would be like locked into the system. It'd be like the Borg kind of. Indisputable, preemptive arrests, that would be like Minority Report. Selective pregnancies, again, why even bother? What would be why bother? Sick or denied medication because they will die anyway. Controlled elections. Well, big brother kind of a control. Elections. Why even have elections? If the computer is so intelligent, it knows who's going to be committing crimes before they commit them, then it's going to know who's the best person to be the governor of this state or the president or, the God emperor of the entire planet or whatever. So, democracy would be obsolete if it's completely disregarding people's desires and deciding for us what we need to do. Then why allow people to vote? So yeah, it is possible, although you won't have that happen to you unless it is your karma to have it happen to you. And I do think that in my case, it's not part of my destiny, my karmic destiny, to become just like this meat cell in this like cybernetic society. Yeah, I think I might get culled or something. Or like in Brave New World, it's like some of the intellectual nonconformists are all just sent to an island, something like that. That might not be too bad. But yeah, I think once you get to this point, then yeah, I don't think that they're really going to be caring all that much about the welfare of the individual. I think individuality would have been like become obsolete or something by then. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred, and he says, what's your thoughts on Daniel Ingram? And I've actually answered this question. This will be the third time in maybe 5 Q&As. So Daniel Ingram has become kind of he's trending, I guess. And I've never really thought all that much about Daniel Ingram. I was told about Daniel Ingram back when I was a monk in Burma. And so I looked up his website on the internet, and he's like on the homepage of his website. This is like back 2012 or something. He's actually declaring himself to be an arahant. And in fact, being an arahant is sort of like the foundation of these other claims that are even more grandiose. And I am skeptical of anyone who brags about how enlightened they are. Like in the text, the Buddha brags about how enlightened he is. And I don't think that the Buddha really said that stuff. I think that is like devotionalism that was added into the texts centuries later, possibly, or at least decades later. So, I if I really thought that the Buddha was bragging about how enlightened he was, I would have less faith in Dhamma than I have now. And Daniel Ingram bragging about how enlightened he is, it really does kind of make me more skeptical, and it makes it more likely to me that he is either overestimating his own attainments or is just a deliberate fraud. I think either of those two would be more likely, just going with statistics, than that he really is a fully enlightened being. And I saw him briefly on a video a few months ago, and he was just like this nervous person, a guy who talked like a normal guy, acted like a normal guy. And I mean, it may be that my preconceptions with regard to who can and can't be enlightened are just wrong. I mean, from the Theravada Buddhist point of view, I mean, there's no way he could possibly be enlightened. But my own point of view is a little more broad than strict orthodoxy in a Theravada Buddhist sense. But even so, I mean, Daniel Ingram is pushing it. And there are a number of people like this who claim to be enlightened, brag about being enlightened, put it on their website that they're enlightened and all this. And then maybe 10, 20 years down the line, they have to admit that they're not really enlightened because they got caught in a sex scandal or something. But I'm not going to just flat out insist that Daniel Ingram isn't fully enlightened, just like I wouldn't flat out insist that J. Krishnamurti wasn't fully enlightened. Although I think I would be more inclined to consider Krishnamurti to be legit, the real deal, than Daniel Ingram. But who knows? That's assuming that being a fully enlightened being even really means anything in any samsaric context. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Cherzasskizizz. And Cherzasskizizz says, questions about basic morality. If ultimately we don't exist and arahants know this and maybe experience it, then why pretty much the worst thing you can do karmically is killing an arahant? Why would that be that bad? Of course, I don't want any harm to arahants. Well, I do think that the way it works in Theravada is if you kill an arhat, then you're guaranteed to go to hell. That's one of the few things you can do that absolutely guarantees that you're going to go to hell. And it's really, I think part of it is just a kind of like Buddhist chauvinism, that only a Buddhist can be fully enlightened, that the fully enlightened Buddhist is like the highest level of human being. An arahant is the highest level of life in the entire cosmos, really. An enlightened being is higher than any god, really. Not necessarily with regard to planes of existence, but with regard to like exaltedness of just venerableness, wisdom. I mean, they're like off the scale. They have transcended the entire scale. It has gods and brahmas and so forth on it. So, like I've mentioned before, that even having bad thoughts about a fully enlightened being can land you in a world of trouble, according to Theravada Buddhism. And the only way it seems to me that this could even work would be if there is like a subliminal telepathic connection between beings, so that deep down, you know, this is like a highly advanced saint and not just an ordinary monk. Otherwise, it's your own karma is subjective. I don't see how dissing someone that you think is a monk is going to land you in hell, or dissing someone you think is just a normal monk is going to land you in hell. Otherwise, like, how is that possible? That somehow their enlightenment has to affect your own mental states, because your own karma is your own mental states. So I think there's a good chance that this sacredness of enlightened beings, to the point that anything you do with regard to an enlightened being is going to have like super magnified karma one way or the other, even if you don't even know they're an enlightened being. That it may be that their vibe has an effect on you, which then it magnifies your own karma or something. That's possible, I guess. But I mean, we don't really exist. Arahants know this. They don't really exist. Our karma doesn't really exist. I guess Orthodox Theravada would say our karma really does exist. We as individuals don't, but the mental states have a basis in reality. I mean, it gets complicated because I have to, like, when I'm answering questions, I try to give my best answer. But if my best answer isn't orthodox, then I kind of have to admit that it isn't orthodox and also give the orthodox position, just because I don't want to be passing off my own like unorthodox theories as orthodox Theravada. And in cases like this, really, I do have a certain amount of skepticism with regard to just the super magnified karma that occurs around enlightened beings when like ordinary people are interacting with them, even if they don't even know that these beings are enlightened beings, that somehow there would have to be some subliminal effect on our own mental states where deep down we know that they are very advanced saints, without consciously being aware that deep down at the level that we are generating karma, that we know that we are dissing a fully enlightened being. So it's complicated. So, and I do think that there is a good chance that this is sort of like the glorification of Buddhism and like the people who have attained the goal of Buddhism, that it's just, in a way, sort of a warning to lay people, don't disrespect monks. You don't know if that monk over there is fully enlightened or not. So you should just you should venerate monks just in case they might be enlightened or something. And I mean, I assume there is some of that involved in this, because otherwise there's no good orthodox explanation for how just thinking a critical thought about an enlightened being is going to cause you to burn in hell, for example. Especially when you don't even know that they're an enlightened being. And there's a number of cases of this sort of thing. There's Kokalika, or Kokalia. There's alternate spellings of his name. There's a sutta where he goes to the Buddha and tells him that Sariputta and Moggallana really don't have good motives. And the Buddha says, don't talk like that. And then Kokalika insists they really don't have good motives. And then as he's walking away, his body breaks out in boils. They get bigger and bigger and then burst, and then he dies. And all he was doing was maybe slandering these monks that if he really thought they were fully enlightened, I don't think he'd be slandering them. And maybe he was even being honest, and maybe it was just his perception. He just misinterpreted something that they did or said that caused him to say that they had bad motives. But according to the text, it didn't matter. He went to hell. Avicii hell, which is the lowest, the bottom pit of hell. So the whole situation is complicated, and it's just kind of an entangled tangle. And I've got to try and pick at it with two different picks. One is my own best guess, and the other is Orthodox Buddhism. And it's in a way, it's very difficult. And I got to try and answer questions relatively briefly because we have so many. And gosh, yeah. So with regard to, before I move on to the next question though, even though I haven't really answered this one very well, is my own best guess is that there is a kind of subliminal awareness that you're dealing with a sage, even though at the conscious ego level, you may not be fully aware of that is going to affect you. But I do think that a lot of it is just exaggerated in the texts, that these, a zillion years in hell, or like Soreya in the Dhammapada commentary, where he sees an arahant bathing in a public bathing place, and this monk had like this golden complexion, and this man Soreya thought, wow, I wish my wife had a complexion like that. His skin is really nice looking. And because of that, he just immediately transforms into a female as a kind of karmic punishment. So, I mean, did he know that this venerable monk was fully enlightened? There's a lot of cases of this in the texts and in the commentaries too, of just having disrespect for an enlightened being can just really mess you up, even if you don't even know they're an enlightened being. And I think I'm a little bit skeptical of that, but certainly if you think somebody is or might be an enlightened being, you shouldn't be too harsh with regard to them. That just like flat out calling Daniel Ingram a charlatan, a fraud, I would hesitate to do that just in case maybe he really is one. That, you know, that Theravada Buddhism's explanations of what an enlightened being are just wrong, and that Daniel Ingram really can be a fully enlightened being. Well, I mean, I would hesitate to just flat out say that he's a fraud or just delusional or whatever. Although I'm not extremely confident that he is the real deal, because I don't know. So anyways, that was Cherzasskizizz is asking kind of difficult questions this time, because his next one is kind of similar with regard to its level of difficulty, at least. He says, if I told a 61-year-old you that we are changing from moment to moment and your body will be different at 71 and your thoughts will be different and dreams and hopes and everything, and in an ultimate reality you don't even exist and you should just live your life, but at the age of 71 you'll have this one severe toothache, would that information give you peace? Oh, it wouldn't be me anyway. Or you will still feel that pain at 71 the same as you would feel it now. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that people don't fully wrap their head around, is if this is an illusion, but still it seems real to us. I mean, this is an ultimate reality that we're living in, but it seems real, and so you should act as though it is real. If you go to hell, you won't really go to hell because there really is no you and there really is no hell, but still, it seems real. So if you don't want to seem like you're in hell, like you don't want to seem that you exist in hell, then you should behave accordingly so that you avoid going to hell. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're happy or unhappy in the grand scheme of things. What difference does it make if this little speck of life on this ball of rock just out in some podunk arm of the Milky Way galaxy, I mean, who cares if it's happy or not? I mean, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. But still, I mean, it kind of matters to us. And so you should still behave accordingly so that you're going to, you know, kind of try to minimize suffering, especially unnecessary suffering. So let's say somebody prophesies that when I'm 71 years old, I'm going to have a bad toothache. At the very least, I could get some toothache remedies ready in preparation for when I'm 71. Maybe take a little better care of my dental hygiene or something. But, I mean, why would it make any difference whether, I mean, philosophically, you can say it's not ultimately real, but it's relatively real. It's conditionally real. It's virtually real. And so long as we're still in the matrix, we still have to act as though it were real. But I would get some toothache remedies handy if I did get this prophecy that I was going to get a toothache. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo asks an unofficial question that won't count as his 3. What's with the smoking hot meditating woman in the thumbnail to your video? I've already explained this in the previous Q&A, that my sweetheart usually does the thumbnails. And she keeps wanting to have these like muscular Chad guys meditating on the thumbnails. And I point out to her that 98% of my viewers are male. They don't want to be looking at Chad guys. So she's okay. And so she makes this hot, buxom female meditating on the thumbnail. And I really did not design it myself. I'm kind of indirectly responsible by talking her out of doing the Chad guy. But it is kind of in keeping with, I did have a series of pictorials on my blog that are still on the blog if you're interested, called Beauties of Meditation. I did like three episodes of it where I was kind of, as a monk, it was sort of like combining the best of both worlds. Just this beautiful woman sitting in meditation. And I mean, it was sort of like my ideal when I was a monk. I mean, I was still a man. I still liked girls, or I guess I should like women at this age. And then just combined with Dharma, the beautiful woman combined with Dharma is sort of symbolized as, you know, this beautiful woman sitting in the full lotus in deep meditation or some such. Anyways, that wasn't even one of the questions. So Romeo says, I recently came across 2 quotes that, as an admitted aversive personality type, I found eye-opening. The first is from Anais Nin, who wrote erotic novels, I'm pretty sure, which is, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. And then the other quote is from Carl Jung, which is, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. So then Romeo says, do either of these quotes relate to Buddhism in any way? If so, how? So the 2 quotes, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. Well, obviously that's going to apply to Buddhism, because the things as they are really, I mean, from the Theravada point of view, all things are is like these shimmering little clouds of like atom-like specks. And each one of those specks really exists for a trillionth of a second and is replaced by another similar speck. But the thing that they are supposedly coalesced into isn't ultimately real. Only the specks are real. You know, it's sort of like pixels, like dots. You got a picture that's a bunch of dots. That the dots might be real, but the image you form of that is just your own perception. That's your own creation. And different people, like if it's an optical illusion kind of a thing, different people might see different things. Rorschach ink blots. Different people will construct different things out of the same ink. And that's going to be based on their karma, their latent tendencies, their predispositions, and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, that would apply to Buddhism. And with regard to Carl Jung's, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Well, that's obviously true, too, because, I mean, it's like, if you're irritated, that's you. That's your own doing. That's not the other person's doing. Somebody can call you a no good so-and-so. If you're offended by that, if that bothers you, that's your fault, which is one of the blatant, like, non-dharmic teachings of, like, political correctness, progressivism, where you've got Buddhists trying to combine Theravada Buddhism with progressivism, but still they've got to adopt the progressive idea that if you're offended, it's somebody else's fault. Especially if you're brown and offended, it's got to be somebody else's fault, especially somebody with a lighter skin tone than you've got. And that's just ridiculous, because if you're offended, that's on you. To be offended is immoral. To be offended is you making your own bad karma because you have reacted with aversion to something out there. And the something out there is, in all likelihood, going to be ultimately neutral. It's just going to be sounds in the air, for example. Even if somebody punches you in the nose and you get offended by that, it's still on you. It's on them that they punched you. And you're going to feel pain, but you don't necessarily have to feel resentment or offense. I mean, the pain is unavoidable, but the resentment or the offense, the feeling of being offended, that is a volitional act on your part that is 100% your own damn fault. And that's an important thing to realize. And a lot of people masquerading as Buddhists in the West just cannot and will not get it. So, getting back to Carl Jung here, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Yeah. It's like, first of all, if you're irritated, and it's your own fault, and so if you have insight, you can see, I mean, why is this bothering me? Why does it bother me when he like says, all the time? I mean, for somebody to say, 2 or 3 times in a sentence, I mean, or like somebody who doesn't use their turn signals. When you're driving on the road, somebody doesn't use their turn signals. Why would that cause you irritation? I mean, it's your own choice. There's 2 drivers. One person is irritated when the other person doesn't use the turn signals. The other person doesn't give a shit. It's like 2 people hear the same words being spoken. One is offended. The other one isn't offended. That indicates that it's a personal thing. It's not inevitable that this person's words or their behavior or whatever is going to cause suffering to others. It depends on the level of wisdom of the others, because they're the ones who are creating their own suffering. So it can help you to understand yourself. It's like, okay, this stuff bothers me and I'm going to have to work on that, because if I were completely wise, nothing would bother me. I mean, some things might cause pain or inconvenience or whatever, but still, I mean, the purpose of Buddhism is to learn suffering and the cause of suffering. And the cause of suffering is desire, or especially the desire for something to be different than it is. So somebody doesn't use their turn signal and you're bothered by that. It's not them not using their turn signal that has bothered you. It is your own insistence that they ought to use their turn signals, your own attachment to the idea that that idiot should have used his turn signal just now. And it's the same way with, like, somebody says the word Eskimo, and there might not be an Eskimo for 100 miles. I mean, there's no Eskimos in sight. Still, you're going to have some liberal with the big problematic plastic rim glasses getting offended. They're not Eskimos, they're Inuit. But this person with the problematic glasses, they're just offended because they insist that everyone has to use the politically correct ethnological names for people. And the person who said Eskimo, I mean, they weren't being racist at all necessarily. They were just, it's just the word they use. It's just like an objective thing. But I think I've been going for a little too long on that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Romeo. Oh, he says, if not, what is your take on these quotes, regardless of whether they relate to Buddhism or not? Well, I mean, they're both true. And I think it wasn't an if not, it was an if. So I think I already answered that question. So I'm just moving on to the next one, which is from Rui. And Rui says, during your Burma days, were you ever summoned to bless a construction site, building, commercial establishment, or any dwelling in general? And yeah, that did happen sometimes. Also, it happened when I was living at Burmese temples in America. I got brought to like Asian restaurants that were just being started. You get invited to houses a lot to bless the house. You chant parita. Somebody gets a new house, a Buddhist person gets a new house, they'll call monks, the monks will come, and the monks will chant parita, which is like blessing the house, driving out any malevolent spirits and that kind of thing. And then the people will earn merit by listening to the Dhamma talk and feeding the monks, which will also help to bless the family. And it happens quite a lot. Although when I was in Burma, it didn't happen as much as when I was living in a place in a Burmese temple in America, just because I was a hermit living out in the woods, and people knew that I really did not accept invitations to houses very much. I preferred to eat just alms food. I wouldn't just go to somebody's house and get food there as a general rule. I did chant parita at a school that was being opened. It was like a private school. I've chanted parita at a few houses in Burma. But it did happen. It's a very common thing in Buddhist Asia that you invite monks to some new house or like a new business to chant parita and bless the place. In fact, in Thailand, I've heard that even cars are that way. Somebody gets a new car, they'll invite some monks to sit in the car and chant parita, and then they might be like making little chalk marks on the roof, like the inside ceiling of the car, that kind of thing. as a way of helping to bless the car so that it won't get in accidents. So yeah, it did happen sometimes. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from OFM. And OFM says, I was wondering what it stood for, and so I said OFM stands for, instead of saying OFM said. OFM said, the Lankavatara Sutra is associated with Yogacara, which in the past I've heard you disavow as something of a departure from traditional Buddhist epistemology and practice. What are your thoughts on Yogacara as an extension of Abhidhamma and early Madhyamaka? Well, I don't think Yogacara is an extension of Abhidhamma because the Mahayana Buddhists really didn't have any use for, paid no attention to Pali Abhidhamma. That Abhidhamma in Mahayana Buddhism is mainly based on the Sarvastivadin version of Abhidharma, which does not have a single text the same as the Theravadan Abhidhamma. So, as an extension of Sarvastivadin Abhidharma, I'm not exactly sure because I have no authority on Sarvastivadin Abhidharma. But Yogacara is somewhat of an extension on Madhyamaka. I have read some history of Mahayana Buddhism where Madhyamaka came first, and then Yogacara was sort of like an elaboration on Madhyamaka. And the only two changes, I think, that Yogacara made that I'm aware of, one is Yogacara insisted on idealism, where mind is real, but matter isn't real. And so Yogacara, the Yogacara view of how our karma works and how we live in society or live in this world is its solipsism. It's kind of like Leibniz's monads, where, I mean, it's like it doesn't even matter if there's anything around you because your karma is completely creating your own world. It's just through like karmic coincidence or the infinity of the universe that your karma dovetails with the karma of everyone around you. But really, even if there really wasn't anybody around you, you would be experiencing the same thing because it's entirely solipsistic. Your mind is creating your reality. That you're not really interacting with anybody. You just perceive yourself to be interacting, and just through, like I said, the infinity of the universe, karmic coincidence or whatever, that it's just dovetailing with these other solipsistic individuals that think that you're interacting with each other when really you're not. So that was kind of an innovation of Yogacara, I think, was like this solipsistic karmic idealism. And also, I have read that the Yogacara Buddhists came up with the Trikaya, the third kaya of the Trikaya, which is you've got the Nirmanakaya, which is the Buddha. And it's the three bodies of the Buddha. Nirmanakaya is like the physical body of the Buddha. You know, Gautama Buddha, the Sakyan sage. Then you've got the Sambhogakaya, which is like the cosmic Buddha up in a celestial realm. And then you've got the Dharmakaya, which is just like the absolute, you know, just like the spirit of enlightenment, which pervades the entire universe, which is kind of the approach taken by these Thai forest Ajahns that I was talking about earlier, which it is not Orthodox Theravada, but Mahayana Buddhism can accept something along those lines. So already you had the Nirmanakaya. I mean, that's what you started with. That was the actual physical human Gautama Buddha. And then early Mahayana came up with the Dharmakaya, which was like their concept of the absolute, which, I mean, you shouldn't really be reifying the absolute. So that was kind of a mistake, but still you got to talk about something. So they reified the absolute, called it the Dharmakaya. But the Sambhogakaya, the celestial Buddha up in heaven, that was, I have read, an innovation of the Yogacara school, which was the next major development in Mahayana after Madhyamaka. And I think it was a step backwards, much like Abhidhamma was a step backwards from the suttas. Then you've got Yogacara, which is a step backward from Madhyamaka. Oh, I should be talking about Madhyamaka. I should wear the Madhyamaka fez. Here it is. There it is, Madhyamaka fez. Okay. So, I mean, those are the two main developments, the two main innovations of Yogacara that I perceive. I could even be wrong with regard to both of these, but Yogacara was like the mind-only school, whereas Madhyamaka, it denied the ultimate existence of anything that is perceptual, anything that you perceive. I mean, it's just void, it's indeterminate. But Yogacara then kind of stepped back from that and said, well, chitta, the mind is real, which is kind of like what Ajahn Martin was talking about. So Ajahn Martin's view is actually more Yogacara, I think, although he'd probably also be a materialist, accept the existence of materialism. But his view that chitta is eternal is more of a Mahayana point of view than a Theravada point of view. So, what are my thoughts on Yogacara as an extension of Abhidhamma? I don't think it really is, at least not with regard to Pali Abhidhamma, and an extension of early Madhyamaka. Yeah, it was a step backwards, I think, from early Madhyamaka. There are probably some innovations that might be somehow good, but I don't know what they would be. I would prefer Madhyamaka to Yogacara pretty much any day of the week. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Jeremy. And Jeremy says, it is interesting that Buddha, the Arahant, is not infallible, concerning all the monks that unalived themselves from his first instructions on contemplating the body. After that mishap, he then recommended the breath as a meditation object. What are your thoughts? Well, I've considered that in the text, the Buddha was not infallible, that he did make mistakes, which you would think if he was omniscient, he wouldn't do. For example, my main example, as a monk, I'd think about this. It's in Vinaya, the book of monastic discipline. And it's in the Patimokkha, actually. It's one of the origin stories of the Patimokkha, where the Buddha realized that there were monks that were getting sick. They were only eating one meal a day, and then they were getting sick for various reasons in the afternoon. So the Buddha allowed them the 5 tonics. I think Ajahn Thanisaro calls them the 5 tonics in his book on Vinaya, which is like butter, ghee, oil, sugar, and butter, ghee, oil, sugar, and honey. Not in that order, but that's the 5. And the monks actually started getting, he allowed it in the morning when monks are generally allowed to eat food. And some monks were getting sicker because they were eating it at the wrong time. So then the Buddha said, okay, you can eat those 5 tonics if you're sick in the afternoon, which is generally the wrong time for monks to be consuming nutriment. And so he made the mistake. It was like he allowed a kind of medicinal substance, which actually made some monks get sicker. So that would apparently be a kind of mistake made by the Buddha, caused by not foreseeing the inevitable result of the judgment. So my thoughts on the Buddha, not being infallible. I mean, it does make sense if he was an enlightened being that is human. I mean, he's a human being. He wouldn't necessarily be omniscient. That's just, it could be just a kind of Buddhist devotionalism glorification of the Buddha. In a way, he would know reality, but this samsara is not ultimately real. So you'd think that if someone is fully enlightened, they're not necessarily going to know how to speak fluent Chinese or know the cube root of 26, anything like that. They're not going to just know everything necessarily. They won't know how many hairs I have in my beard. So I think that being enlightened isn't necessarily the same as being infallible at this phenomenal worldly level. What happens at the phenomenal worldly level is largely irrelevant. So, yeah, and then the example Jeremy gives here is that the Buddha was talking about the loathsomeness of the body, And then he went off in retreat, meditated in the forest, and monks were getting so disgusted from their own body, like contemplating what the Buddha was saying about the loathsomeness of the body, that they started auto-terminating, or actually getting this other monk, I think it was a monk, he was like volunteering to help them along. And I think that was the first case of murder in the text. That was when the Buddha made the rule against murder. It's a parajika offense, warranting excommunication from the Sangha for life if you cause the death of another human being. And this first perpetrator, I mean, the rule wasn't laid down yet, so he wasn't excommunicated. But I think that would be less of an error than even what he did about the 5 tonics, where he was making monks sicker instead of better, healthier. But what are my thoughts about what exactly? I'm not sure what Jeremy is angling for here. See, with regard to recommending the breath as a meditation object, I'm not sure how that, I mean, what there is to comment on that. Could have just been a coincidence, or kind of backing away from contemplating on the loathsomeness of the body, although the loathsomeness of the body was still a major meditation theme in early Buddhism. So I guess the main question is just about the fallibility of a fully enlightened Buddha, or a fully enlightened being in general, which I think is still possible. But I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, did early Buddhism mention rebirth and karma? I heard this Indian professor say that the Buddha was an atheist who didn't believe in rebirth or karma. These things were added later. Well, the Indian professor is probably mistaken, that he is thinking from an intellectual point of view, so he's stuck in intellectualism. He cannot comprehend apophatic mysticism. The Buddha was a mystic. He wasn't an atheist or a skeptic, or you could say maybe he was an atheist just because he wasn't talking about God, that he would refer to the absolute as nibbana or nibbana dhatu and not as some deity. So he could have been an atheist to that extent. But I mean, the Buddha was like avoiding making assertions. Like in the Atthakavagga, he just flat out says, don't make assertions. He said with regard to himself, I do not say this is so, which is what fools say mutually to each other. So it could be that when he was originally teaching like really advanced veteran ascetics, he was teaching them the radical, just don't have views, don't have opinions, don't follow dogmas, just get rid of all of that. It's all perceptual delusion. In which case, he probably wasn't talking much, if at all, about rebirth and karma. But when he starts teaching people that are less advanced, I think there's a good chance that he was teaching things like rebirth and karma to people that weren't ready for the teachings of the Atthakavagga yet. But like if the Atthakavagga is typical of the earliest teachings, which is when the Buddha was just teaching like veteran, advanced spiritual practitioners who had already renounced the world, then he might not have been teaching about rebirth and karma, because he's teaching about right now, first, second, third, fourth noble truths that don't necessarily involve rebirth and karma. So that is sort of, there's a certain amount of guesswork involved, but I would assume that when he wasn't teaching his most advanced level of teachings, that he was accepting rebirth and karma. And obviously, if you read the suttas, there's plenty of mention of rebirth and karma. Especially karma is important in that, for example, according to the rules of monastic discipline, if a non-Buddhist wants to be ordained, they have to go through a probation period. I think it's like 4 months of probation, because they don't want to be importing their own like false dogmas from some previous system into Buddhism and declaring that Buddhism. They want to make sure that they're really a Buddhist now and not just an Ajivaka who wants to dress like a Buddhist. So, but Hindus or Vedic Brahmanists in those days didn't have to go through the probationary period because they were karmavadins. They already believed in Kamma and this kind of stuff. So that was close enough to Buddhism that they could be accepted they could be ordained without probation, the probationary period. So I think, there's no proof one way or the other whether the Buddha really did teach rebirth and karma or whether it was added later, but I think there is a good chance of it. I think it is probable, more than 50-50, that the Buddha really did teach rebirth and karma. And the suttas are just full of the Buddha teaching rebirth and karma. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rakasa. And Rakasa says, can you talk about your interpretation of the movie The Seventh Seal? I just read your blog post on Fight Club, and you mentioned Seventh Seal as one of the movies you've dug into in order to better understand it. I couldn't find another post or video where you go into depth on it specifically, so I apologize if you've already done so elsewhere. I don't think I have. And The Seventh Seal is a profound movie. I saw it many years ago, back when I was still a monk. It's an Ingmar Bergman movie. It's all in Swedish with subtitles. So I would consider watching it again, but I have to watch it alone without my sweetheart because she doesn't like foreign movies with subtitles. She wants to be able to see the movie without having to always look down at the bottom with the subtitles. So let's see. The Seventh Seal, it's mainly about a man who desperately wants to believe in God, but he cannot find proof of God. It's like the Seventh Seal is a movie about the problem of the silence of God. He will not prove himself existent. You just have to take it on faith. And he was the protagonist in the movie. He's like a crusader who comes back from the Crusades. He's gone from Sweden for a long time. He comes back to Sweden, and the bubonic plague or some kind of plague is running rampant. And he's seen all these atrocities in the name of God in the Holy Land during this crusade. He comes back to his homeland, and it's just being wiped out by this horrible plague. And there is the good family, where their name is Mary and Joseph, and they've got a baby, which is obviously symbolic. And the movie is probably the most famous thing about this movie is this knight who comes back from the Crusades. As soon as he gets back to Sweden, death is on the beach saying, it's time for you to go. You got to die now. And the knight challenges him to a game of chess. And so, like, one of the most iconic scenes from the whole movie is this knight who desperately wants to believe in God, playing chess with essentially death. And they play throughout the movie. And there's like this one scene where this couple, Mary and Joseph, who are really nice people, and they're like some of the best sign of goodness that this knight has seen. In fact, they're like the best evidence of the existence of God and genuine goodness in this world. And he's sitting there out in this field with them. And the lady, Mary, has picked some wild strawberries, and she serves him this bowl of wild strawberries with milk. And he's just, I can't remember the exact quote. I'm sorry I can't. But he just says, this is the closest I've come to certainty. This is the best sign of goodness in this world, is me sitting here with you eating these strawberries. And then there's this other scene where they're just passing through some town, and there's a woman who's going to be burned as a witch. And he desperately wants to know if she's supposedly talked to the devil or something like that. And so he wants to know if there's a devil, there's probably a God too. So he goes to her and asks her, have you really spoken with the devil? And she just says, look into my eyes and you'll know. And he looks at it and all he sees is fear. But I mean, it's been a long time since I watched the movie. It's been a long time since I've tried to really understand the movie. But I mean, the main theme of the movie is just the problem of the silence of God and how you have to find your evidence for God in this world. You know, despite all the ickiness, that you can still find it if you look hard enough. And he was looking real hard. That was like he was driven. He had to find some sign of justification for his faith before he finally loses the game of chess to death and has to die. So let's see here. I guess that's good enough. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mooners, and we're already 2.5 hours. This is going to be at least 3 hours long, I have a feeling. I apologize, but what can I do? I got to answer your questions. It's my job. It's why we're here, answering questions. So this next question is from Mooners, and Mooners says, if Kamma is morally subjective and dependent on mental states, does it open the way for moral relativism like we see today? No, it doesn't open the way for moral relativism like we see today because it's based on human psychology. And there's just an empirical fact that certain actions are going to cause certain mental effects on another person. It's like murder, for example. If you murder somebody, then it's going to cause certain effects on you, just really drastic, radical effects on your mind, which are going to then manifest at some point as the fruition of karma. So moral relativism it's all just a social construct, but it's not all just a social construct. That there is such a thing as human nature, and it's just a law of human psychology that certain acts are going to have certain effects on your mind. As a general rule, I mean, it's not going to be completely cookbook, just the same for every single person, but there are going to be significant trends. And there's going to be like a certain spectrum of, what the effect's going to be depending on your, how the action connects to your mental states and so forth. So, I mean, moral relativism is just based on the idea that morality is purely a cultural construct, whereas Buddhism doesn't have that idea. Morality is based on just human psychology, and like whatever takes you closer to enlightenment is good, and whatever takes you farther from enlightenment is bad. And it's not just purely a cultural construct. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Apocalypse Chow. And this is kind of a strange one. Would you kindly explain the metaphysics of Dawn of the Dead? And Dawn of the Dead, he's got his characteristic bullet points because he used to be called Skuladin or Skuladin. One bullet point says, there's no more room in hell. And then, so the dead will walk the earth. Well, that's just that's just really facile, because hell is never going to run out of room. There's always plenty of room for hell. So, or room in hell, I should say. So the dead will walk the earth. Yeah, I don't know. It's just sort of comic book meta. It's I don't know how mythology kind of stuff. It's like, I mean, I never saw Dawn of the Dead. I was never really into zombies much until I saw the movie World War Z, which actually was a good zombie movie. I liked the movie World War Z, and it really impressed upon me the hard fact that fast zombies are way worse than slow zombies. But also, I did watch The Walking Dead. And, I mean, clearly, you can't take it very seriously. I mean, it has to be a metaphysical, magical kind of a thing that somebody, their body is broken so that they die, but still they can just keep walking around and they don't have to eat. They don't even have to breathe. Somehow their body is still functioning, even though it's completely like half rotten and dead. I mean, there's no way any kind of virus, like some virus developed in a bioweapons lab that somehow leaks out, it can happen sometimes, that it would cause zombies like in The Walking Dead. Because, I mean, it just, reality just doesn't work that way. The only way it could possibly happen would be if it was some kind of supernatural event that was causing these bodies to reanimate, even though, I mean, they're so broken they couldn't possibly work. So, let's see. The metaphysics of dawn of the dead. There's no more room in hell, so the dead will walk the earth. Yeah, it's just silly because hell is, I mean, there's always more room in hell. They pack them in real tight. No, they really don't even have to pack them in tight. There's never going to be any standing room only in hell. Everyone who's worthy of hell can wind up there, regardless of how many beings are already there. Already an infinite number of beings there. So, I guess I'll just move on to Apocalypse Chow's next question. In one instance, Jesus performed a sleight of hand where he transferred the inner demons from one person into a herd of swine, which were then driven mad and then drowned. What are the pigs' karmic momentum, which burned off somebody else's karma? Well, the burning off of somebody else's karma really wasn't the pig's own karma. I mean, that was irrelevant to the pig's own karma. The pigs just had this bad karma, which allowed them to have a demon enter their body, and then they just immediately run into this lake and drown. Yeah, I mean, it's a weird story in the Bible. That's Legion. The Buddha, not the Buddha, Jesus crosses over the Lake of Galilee or something, and there's this tribe of people called the Gadarenes who live on the other side, or maybe it's just the town Gadara or something. Anyways, there's this crazy man living in a cemetery who's just shrieking and cutting himself with rocks. And when Jesus asks him his name, he says, "My name is Legion, for we are many," which implies that he was possessed by a great many malevolent entities. So then Jesus drove these evil spirits out of Legion. I don't know what his name was after that. And they all went into this herd of pigs who then just immediately rushed down into the lake and drowned. So the pigs just had bad karma to get suddenly possessed by a demon and drown. I mean, it didn't last very long. You know, it's probably more merciful than having their throat cut by a butcher. So, yeah, I mean, the pig's karma didn't have necessarily anything to do with the karma of Legion. It just dovetailed well enough that Legion had the karma of having these demons possessing him temporarily, driven out, and then these pigs just happened to have the convenient karma of being receptive to being possessed by a demon, and then they drowned. But there wasn't any, I mean, the karma of the pigs wasn't necessarily to absorb the demons that were driven out of somebody else. It was just to get the demon and drown. So I guess I answered that one. So Apocalypse Now's third question. If the world ends and everyone else dies, should I just try to live as long as possible? I haven't read enough scripture to know where everyone would go, but I guess wherever they arrive will just become hell. Not necessarily. Always, it seems like a waste to just leave after reaching the highest promotion possible. Most superlative man, strongest, smartest, most handsome, largest penis with dominion over the earth. Well, if everyone dies except you, then, I mean, how are you going to know that you're the only one left? You know, if it's like an Omega Man situation, then, you know, there might still be a few other people. Like there's a movie made in New Zealand back in the 80s, I think, called The Quiet Earth, where this guy thinks he's the only man, but it turns out that there's a few other people, like maybe 1 in 10 million people are still alive. And so he eventually meets up with like 2 other people. So, I mean, if I woke up one day and I was the only person, I mean, it would be quite a shock, I have to admit, but I don't think I would immediately auto-terminate. I might be looking around, see if there's anybody else. I mean, you can still just live a life of solitude. Why not? I mean, like we were talking about earlier, you shouldn't, from the Buddhist point of view, you shouldn't auto-terminate unless you've attained the goal. And if you're the only person there, you'll have plenty of solitude for practice and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, the Buddhist thing to do would just practice Dhamma, just continue making progress for as long as you're still alive and able to make progress. And if everyone else disappeared, I mean, why would it, wherever they arrived, just become hell? I mean, they were here and this wasn't hell. There are an infinite number of worlds, infinite number of places they can go. They'll go wherever it is appropriate for their karma to land them. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from GameFap. And GameFap says, what is your gaming experience like? I feel you would have been a big Doom guy back in the day. My gaming experience, well, you have to bear in mind that I became a monk in like 1991, and I remained a monk until 2021. So like the MMOs, like the golden age of like World of Warcraft and all that, Doom, that was when I was a monk and I had no experience and no exposure to that at all. It was like, I remember when I was a kid, our family got this really cool video game called Pong. And it was really a good game because you could play 3 different sports on this one video game. You could play tennis, hockey, or handball. And actually things even got better than Pong gradually over time. And by the time I was in high school, we would occasionally skip school and drive 50 miles to the town of Olympia where they had a big mall. They didn't even have malls in Aberdeen back then. Not yet anyway. Or if they did, it was a rudimentary kind of mall. And we'd go to the mall had this place called the Gold Mine, which was an arcade, and you'd go into the arcade and play video games. So that was what gaming was like when I was like in high school, is you put in a quarter and play a video game like Pac-Man. I got really good at Pac-Man. I was like relatively drunk one night when I was in college, and I got up to the 5th key in Pac-Man. And for those of you who don't know what Pac-Man is, I mean, there's like this fruit or something that appears on a screen, and if you eat that, it causes the monsters to turn blue and run away, and you can eat them instead. But at the end, there's 7 keys that looks just like a house key or something. If you get through all 7, legend has it that the monsters all surrender. They got like white flags and you win. And I was like drunk in college at a roller rink or something. I got up to the 5th one. I was just in the flow, just a few beers. I probably had more than a few, but you just get into this like spontaneous flow under alcohol sometimes. Like I was better at pool when I was drunk too. And I got to the 5th key and died. That was by far the closest I ever came to winning Pac-Man. But after getting out of, even when I was a monk, when I was in America on the internet, that there were certain video games that I would play. They were flash games. So I never got into these immersive MMOs. I never really got into that. Probably the best video game I played on the internet was, it's called World's End. And I think it was made by Polish people because the people have like Polish names and stuff. I think there's even like a guy named Kurwa in the game. And it was then for some reason, Google just decided to abolish Adobe Flash from its platform. All these games, just hundreds, thousands of games you could play, they just poofed out of existence. So I can't play World's End. It's created by some company called Mezzanine Stairs. If you ever get the chance, it's worth playing. It's like a turn-based strategy game, which is what I prefer. I don't like games where you have to go fast. So nowadays, there's only really 2 games that I play. One is I kill zombies on my phone. It's The Walking Dead No Man's Land is the name of the game. And I'm becoming almost invincible on that. And also there's this other really good video game called Sudoku. It's not really big on special effects, but the numbers are very realistic. I mean, those numbers look like real numbers on the screen there. And that's it. I mean, the whole MMO thing, World of Warcraft and all that, I never really got into. Just partly just because I was a monk back when all that stuff was going on. And also, I'm just not into having to move fast. I like to carefully think out what I'm going to do, strategize, come up with a winning strategy and play that way. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River, and this is an easy one. What's your opinion of Shanti Deva? And I have no idea who Shanti Deva is. No clue. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Dhamma River. He says, I once heard you say the following quote, most Buddhists, especially in the West, are not trying to wake up. They're just trying to sleep more comfortably, unquote. It was during a group video call. I think Brian Rue was one of the people on it. Honestly, this was the quote that made me look you up on the internet and watch more of your videos. It's one of the greatest and most badass quotes I've ever heard from anyone in the world. I agree with you. Can you please elaborate a little bit more on it? I just want you to expand your message, which I believe it's extremely important in these modern times. Thank you. So he wants me to elaborate on this quote. Most Buddhists, especially in the West, are not trying to wake up. They're just trying to sleep more comfortably. And it is true. And I don't think that I actually came up with that on my own. I think that is a paraphrase of some of the stuff that Paul Lowe has taught in the past, that he would say that like people are practicing spirituality as a kind of cope for not really wanting to be enlightened. That if you really want to be enlightened, you'll be enlightened. It's just that you have like these aversions for it, fear of annihilation and so forth. And so you compensate by just having these spiritual practices that you do that kind of helps you to feel better about not really deep down wanting to be enlightened. So you can just sort of play at spirituality and remain unenlightened, and which is essentially remaining asleep. And I mean, especially in the West, people just want to feel good about themselves. I think a lot of people who practice meditation, it's like stress relief kind of stuff. Or like the one Buddhist group that I was interacting with as a monk in the West, the main Western Buddhist group, that, I mean, they would just kind of glide around with these blissful smiles on their face when they're in the Dharma hall. And if anyone would bring up something, you know, somebody raises their hand and says, what should a person do if they're like the victim of incest? And it's like the leaders of the group would just shut it down immediately. It was like someone had just dropped a brick. This like, we'll talk about that later. And then they just get back to, you know, something blissful so that everyone can feel comfortable and good about themselves. They didn't really want to deal with anything unpleasant. And so, I mean, if you want to become enlightened, you have to be able to deal with anything. You know, you have to be able to deal with anything that life throws at you. You can't just avoid the unpleasant, uncomfortable stuff because you're never going to learn how to deal with it. And I mean, most people in the West are just too lukewarm. They're not willing to do the really deep, harrowing stuff that you have to do if you really want to like cook all those seeds and get everything straightened out and cleared up and so that you can become enlightened. And so, I mean, they just kind of compensate for being lukewarm and, you know, meditate. And some people use meditation as a kind of substitute for narcotics. You know, they get like this nice feeling that they meditate for the nice feeling rather than having to face any skeletons in any closets, that kind of thing. That they kind of see Dharma as just feeling good. And, you know, they don't want to contemplate death or anything like that. A lot of people are like that. And like I've said before, even Buddhist monks, I think a lot of Buddhist monks, if somebody invented the enlightenment pill where you were guaranteed to become enlightened by taking this pill, they would just run from it in terror. Because they just don't want to become enlightened deep down. You know, they might say, you know, I want to be enlightened, but, you know, not just yet. Sort of like St. Augustine praying to God, you know, save me from my sins, but not yet. So let's see here. Just trying to sleep more comfortably. Yeah, I mean, that's basically it. A lot of people, they just don't even have a concept of enlightenment. They're so locked into their intellect. They just have to see everything perceptually. And they want reality to be in accordance with this human ape psychology. They think that the world really is human ape psychology and not just this projection of human ape psychology onto a world or onto, the outside, whatever it is. So, where do I go from here? But it is fairly clear. Most people do not really want to be enlightened. Even most Buddhists do not want to really be enlightened. Even most monks do not really want to be enlightened. They want a better rebirth. They want to make some progress, but they don't want to do anything totally radical so that their personality dissolves, anything like that. That's scary. So I guess I've elaborated on it at least a little bit of commentary anyway. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Wayne. And we're actually getting close to the end here. So we're doing pretty good. No, it's 3 hours. So we're not going to be less than 3 hours, but we'll be less than 3.5 hours. Unless I just start digressing wildly, which can happen at any moment. So anyways, the next question is from Wayne. And Wayne says, have you read the Zen teachings of Bodhidharma by Red Pine? What are your thoughts on true nature? Oh, wait, this is 3 questions. Damn, we got way more than 50 questions. Once I start separating these questions, getting 1 question mark per paragraph. Okay. Wayne says, have you read the Zen teachings of Bodhidharma by Red Pine? No, I have not. The only thing by Red Pine I ever read was the poems of Han Shan, which was kind of a disillusioning kind of thing. Han Shan was, he was a hermit who lived in a cave in China, medieval China. And he's considered to be like a Zen master. He was kind of a Taoist and into Zen at the same time. And according to the legends, he was like this Zen master. But you read his poems, and it turns out that he was like a Mandarin, like a bureaucrat, an official who happened to be on the wrong side of like a civil war. There was like a coup or something, and he wound up being red listed. And when you were red listed, that wasn't good. That meant that, your head was going to wind up landing in a basket or something. And so he went off and became like a hermit, mainly to hide from the authorities. And in some of his poetry, he's like moaning and complaining about how, he's got to live out in this cave instead of being like this high-ranking official. He couldn't have been a really high-ranking official anyway because he was like lame. And back then, in order to be like a high-ranking Mandarin bureaucrat, you had to be like physically perfect in addition to having mastered the Chinese classics like Confucius and all that. And mastery of like horse riding and archery and all this. And he was lame. He couldn't be nothing more than like a middle-level bureaucrat. He complained about that. One time he saw some of the emperor's wives that were, out frolicking in the forest one day, and he's just like pining over them. So it turns out that, he wasn't the mystical, magical Zen master that tradition makes of him. And it's probably that way with a lot of these Chinese Zen masters, that they've just been glorified through a kind of mythology. And that was like one of the main things I learned from reading Red Pine's translation of the poems of Han Shan. But I didn't even really answer the question because, well, I guess I did at the very beginning. He said, have you read the Zen teachings of Bodhidharma by Red Pine? And no, I didn't. So I could have just said no and moved on to the next one. But then it's like the closest thing I can to answering the question, like, well, I have read this other thing by him. So I'm just going to move on to Wayne's next question. What are your thoughts on true nature? True nature. Is that like in Zen? Like, according to the legend, the sixth patriarch, Hui Neng, when, according to the legend, he takes the bull and robe of the patriarch And the patriarch tells him to just flee because nobody's going to tolerate this illiterate barbarian cook who's not even a fully ordained monk becoming the next patriarch. But there was this one monk who doggedly hunted him down, and he's going to take that bowl and robe back to the monastery where it supposedly belonged. And Han Shan asked him this question. It's like, before your mother and father were born, what was your original face? And that was like this koan that hit this monk. And I mean, it was like it hit him hard and he couldn't answer it. And then he realized that Hui Ning really was the sixth patriarch. And so maybe the true nature is the same as the original face. And I mean, you can't really have thoughts on it. I mean, it's a Zen koan. True nature. I mean, the true nature is just, I mean, it's not even correct to say it's infinite formless consciousness, because you cannot reify the ultimate. You cannot reify the absolute. Anything you say about it is going to be invalid, which is, I mean, most people just don't get this, including most Buddhist monks, I think. So true nature, I mean, it's indescribable for starters. But I mean, if you want to call it as a kind of makeshift, infinite formless consciousness, go right ahead. And that would be the true nature of everybody. They all share the same true nature, just as in the Upanishads, everyone shares the same self or Atman. So I'm just going to move on to Wayne's third question. Is it equivalent to spirit awareness or universal consciousness? Oh, so this is sort of a follow-up on the second one, true nature. Is it equivalent to spirit awareness or universal consciousness? I mean, you can call it all three. It'd be universal spirit, universal awareness. You know, it'd be like the element of awareness. That's what consciousness is awareness. So you could call it all three. I mean, you can call it whatever you like. You can call it bleen if you want to. And calling it bleen might actually be just as valid as calling it anything else. But, yeah, I mean, apophatic mysticism is the way to go, which, I mean, you cannot express the highest truth in words. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The very first words of the Tao Te Ching. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Arain. And Arain says, what are the top three qualities that practicing as a strict monk gave you? She dictated it, so I had to include the And what she meant was, what three qualities helped me to become a functioning layman after I stopped being a monk? So what are the top three qualities that practicing as a strict monk gave you in order to help me to transition smoothly into being a layperson? And one of them is a kind of detachment that, I mean, a monk is supposed to see the world as just stimuli. You know, it's like when you look upon the world, it's like you're seeing images on a movie screen. So there's always this detachment. And so first I was seeing images on a movie screen with regard to being a monk. And then I started seeing images on a movie screen with regard to being a layperson. And so, I mean, it really didn't affect me very much. Not that I even ultimately exist, but still there's like this detachment from this world that causes me to be able to make transitions more easily than someone whose life is just totally in upheaval and they're melting down and so forth. So that would be one of the qualities that practicing as a strict monk gave me. Another one would be austerity. And maybe I shouldn't say it, but a certain amount of asceticism can actually be very helpful in like dealing with a woman who's being unreasonable, for example. That it's just, you're used to just harsh reality, and like going to work, having to work for a living, getting up early in the morning, which I don't do anymore because I work nights, but having to get up at 6 a.m. And I mean, it's like an ascetic practice. Having to work all day, it's like an ascetic practice. And I mean, I just got used to that. I mean, when I was a monk, you know, I'm just dripping with sweat in the blazing hot wastelands of central Burma, sleeping on a concrete floor with a piece of wood for a pillow, all this kind of stuff. I mean, being a layperson is actually pretty cushy by comparison in a lot of respects. So that would be another quality. So first I've got like detachment, and then austerity, and then what other three qualities? Practicing as a strict monk. Oh boy, what would be the third one? I mean, an increased amount of metta from my fellow human, I guess, would help. That I really, being like a solitary renunciant, in a way, it kind of helped me to appreciate my fellow humans better. You know, it gave me, like, for example, being a monk where you're trying to perfect yourself, trying to purify your mind, and you see that that is a tall order. That is not easy to do. So that it causes me to have more Christian charity and acceptance of the common person who really doesn't have much of a chance other than just being kind of a fuck up. So it's like, even if I was trying as hard as I could to be a saint, and I just stayed being stuck who I was, essentially, because that's the way it is. I mean, you're just stuck being who you are. It's very difficult to just stop being who you are and start being somebody else. Schopenhauer had a lot to say about that. So it caused me to just have more patience and sympathy and metta, you know, benevolence towards human beings in general, which helps me to fit into this world better than before I was a monk and just kind of like despised the human race in general. So I guess those would be the three. And then Aaron's second question, what are the top three habits as a monk that turned into that made it more difficult for you to adjust as a layperson? So 3 habits as a monk that made it more difficult for me to adjust as a layperson? Ooh, well, I mean, just the solitude aspect caused me to have fewer social skills, I guess. You know, being a hermit is not very good for developing social skills. And so there's that. You know, I've had to take a crash course in like just being polite, I guess. Maybe that might be one of the habits as a monk. Another habit is just when you don't have to work for a living, you can just, I don't know if you call it lazy, but I mean, you're at leisure most of the time. And then all of a sudden having all this stuff, you have to go into like survival mode, and you just got to do all this stuff and take care of everything. And that was kind of difficult. That was kind of a shock to the system, where when you're a monk, I mean, you don't have to worry about much of anything. First of all, everything's very simplified, and you're not even allowed to cook your own food. It's people just give you your food. And so, yeah, I mean, that would probably be just the habit of not having to do very much, and then all of a sudden having to, you know, like support myself and my woman, and, you know, pay bills, that kind of thing. So that would be 2. And then the third habit that made it difficult for me to turn back into a layperson, man. Let's see. The third habit that, well, shouldn't mention that one, I guess. I can't really think of a third one other than one that's kind of unmentionable. Something to do with being celibate for 30 years and then suddenly not being celibate anymore. It caused a certain shock to my system, I think. And it wasn't just physical shock, it was more of an emotional thing. It's like when, you know, this like sexuality is like this, no, mustn't do it, no, mustn't do it. And then all of a sudden it's okay to do it. In fact, it's kind of like my husbandly duty, that it really required a major shift from 30 years of conditioning to all of a sudden, you know, doing this thing that I'd been wanting to do, but just like, nope, can't do it. That it was like this weird, it's like neurotic conditioning and so forth that had to be overcome in order to really come close to being like normally functioning. And I'm not saying that, you know, there was anything really outwardly horribly abnormal, but it really took some adjustment, so to speak. And I'm not going to go any more details than that. God. So anyways, Then there's the last question, the very last question, which is from PSA. And PSA says, what's today's beverage? What's the flavor, and are the contents of it healthy for you, or is it all chemicals? Well, with regard to chemicals, everything's a chemical. Water is a chemical. Water is dihydrogen oxide. So many people are killed every year by water. Anyways, my first beverage, the primary beverage, was about maybe 40% organic coffee. I don't know what country it came from, but it came from a country where there's like little brown people speaking in foreign languages. They're like picking the coffee beans by hand and probably like spreading it out in the sun and everything. And then the other 60% was milk. It wasn't organic milk. I'm sorry to say that the store was out of organic milk when I went there. Please go easy on me. I would have got the organic if they had it. But it's guaranteed not to have any of those like hormone injection stuff that they give to the cows to make them give more milk. So at least there's that. So that was, I mean, the primary beverage was it was like coffee and milk, probably a little more milk than coffee. And the second one is this, which it's got some chemicals in it, but then again, water's the chemical. And I'm happy to say that just this one can has got 50% of my daily requirement of pantothenic acid. And the flavor, I don't know, what flavor is Red Bull? They just invented some new flavor. Maybe it's just like pantothenic acid flavor or something. Yeah, I don't know exactly what the flavor of Red Bull is. So that's it. I'm done. My golly. And like I always say at the end, when I should be saying at the beginning, if you have any questions, no more than 3 per episode, please. And I do count question marks. If you want to ask one question that's got like 5 question marks in it, that's a no-no. That is transgressive. So if you have any questions that you think I can answer about Buddhism, meditation, early Buddhism, Theravada especially, pre-Theravada, meditation, monasticism, philosophy in general, spirituality in general. I mean, the farther you get away from Theravada Buddhism, the less likely it is that I'll be able to give like an educated answer, anything remotely resembling an authoritative answer. But still, you might be surprised sometimes. So ask them in the comments below if you please. And smash the like button. Don't just press it. Smash the son of a bitch. If you liked it. If you didn't like it, then don't do it. That would be kind of dishonest, I guess. And subscribe if you haven't already. And be happy. And now I got to press the stop recording button here.